Hey guys, tonight we step into the sweltering summer streets of 19th century American cities, where the wealthy are packing their trunks in panic, boarding trains with desperate urgency, and fleeing as if some invisible army were marching toward their front doors. You stand in the thick, humid air of a July afternoon in Manhattan, and you can practically taste the danger on your tongue, a metallic, rotting sweetness that coats everything and everyone. The cobblestones beneath your feet radiate heat like bread fresh from the oven, and somewhere nearby, a horse collapses from exhaustion, while flies swarm in clouds so thick they blur the outline of buildings. This is summer in urban America, and if you are wealthy enough to escape, you do not hesitate for even a moment. If you are poor, well, you probably would not survive this season anyway, or at least that is what the newspapers seem to suggest with alarming regularity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing that someone in Tokyo is drifting off just as someone in Toronto is settling into bed. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a corner in Lower Manhattan, and the year is 1852. The sun has been beating down on the city for 3 weeks straight now, and what passes for a breeze carries nothing but the promise of more misery. You notice that something strange is happening on your street. The brownstone mansions that normally hum with activity, servants polishing brass knockers, children playing on stoops, carriages arriving with calling cards, have gone eerily quiet. Shutters are closed tight against the heat, but more than that, they are closed against something invisible and far more terrifying. The wealthy are leaving, and they are leaving fast. This mass exodus was not a casual vacation choice. You have to understand that for affluent Americans in the 1800s, summer in the city represented a genuine threat to survival. We are not talking about mild discomfort or the inconvenience of perspiration stains on silk waistcoats. We are talking about death rates that spiked so dramatically during warm months that insurance companies actually adjusted their premiums based on seasonal residents. If you told your insurance agent that you plan to remain in New York or Philadelphia or Boston through August, he might raise an eyebrow and quietly increase your policy cost. The numbers did not lie, and the numbers were terrifying. You watch as a family emerges from one of those quiet brownstones, and the scene unfolds like a military evacuation. Trunks are being loaded onto a wagon, not one or two, but 7, 8, 9 massive steamer trunks that contain everything a family might need for 3 months away from home. The lady of the house wears a travelling dress of dark bombazine, practical and sombre, as if she were attending a funeral rather than departing for a seaside holiday. In a sense, she is fleeing a funeral, potentially her own, potentially her children's. The servants move with urgent efficiency, and you notice that several of them will be travelling too, because wealthy families did not simply abandon their standards of living when they abandoned the city. The reasons for this annual flight were numerous and overlapping, creating a perfect storm of motivation that made summer departure not just desirable, but essentially mandatory for anyone with means. First and foremost, there was the simple, unavoidable reality of disease. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, and a dozen other illnesses that we now understand and can largely prevent were mysterious killers in the 19th century. They struck without warning, without apparent logic, and without mercy. A healthy man could eat breakfast with his family and be dead by dinner. A child could develop a fever at noon and be buried by the following morning. These were not exaggerations designed to sell train tickets. These were documented realities that every urban family knew firsthand. Historians still argue whether the wealthy truly understood the connection between urban conditions and disease, or whether they simply acted on instinct and superstition that happened to align with epidemiological reality. What we do know is that mortality statistics told a clear story. Cities were significantly more dangerous in summer than in winter, and the difference was stark enough that anyone paying attention would notice. Death records from New York City in the 1850s show that infant mortality more than doubled during July and August compared to January and February. Adults fared somewhat better, but not by much. The graveyards filled faster when the temperature climbed, and everyone could see it happening. You follow that departing family down toward the docks, where steamships are loading passengers for journeys up the Hudson River or across Long Island Sound. The scene is chaotic in that particularly 19th century way. Porters shouting, horses stamping, steam whistles piercing the thick air. But beneath the chaos, there is an unmistakable current of anxiety. People are not boarding these vessels for pleasure alone. They are boarding them for survival. The newspapers have been running daily counts of fever cases, and this morning's edition reported 17 new deaths from something the doctors are calling summer complaint, which is really just a polite way of saying that people are dying from diarrhea so severe that it drains the life from their bodies within days. The wealthy passengers clutch their tickets with something approaching religious devotion. These slips of paper represent passage to safety, to clean air, to cool breezes, to survival. You notice that some families are sending their children ahead with nurses while parents remain behind for a few more days to settle business affairs. This practice was common enough that it had its own vocabulary. Children were sent to the country, as if the countryside were a hospital or a church, a place of healing and protection rather than simply a geographic location. But here is a detail that might surprise you, a quirky little tidbit that reveals the strange logic of the era. Some wealthy families refused to leave until they had consulted not their doctors, but their astrologers. Yes, in the 1840s and 50s, astrological consultation was fashionable enough among certain social sets that departure dates were sometimes chosen based on planetary alignments rather than train schedules. The logic, such as it was, suggested that travelling under favourable stars would protect against the dangers of both the journey and the destination. One society matron in Boston reportedly delayed her departure by 6 days because her astrologer warned that Mercury was in a troublesome position, and she feared that travelling during such a period would invite disaster. Her friends thought her eccentric, but they did not think her entirely foolish. In an era when doctors were bleeding patients and prescribing mercury for ailments, consulting the stars seemed no more absurd than consulting the medical profession. You return your attention to the street, where the emptying of the city continues with methodical determination. House after house shows signs of seasonal closure. Some families have hung black crepe over their doorways, not as a sign of mourning but as a signal to potential burglars that the residence is being watched, a practice that seems both paranoid and entirely reasonable given the circumstances. Others have hired caretakers to live in their homes during the summer months, occupying servant quarters and maintaining a presence that would discourage thieves and vandals. The geography of escape was remarkably consistent across the decades. Wealthy New Yorkers headed north toward the Hudson Valley, northeast toward Newport and the Connecticut shore, or east toward the newly fashionable communities of Long Island. Philadelphians escaped to the Jersey Shore or the mountains of Pennsylvania. Bostonians claimed the coastline of Maine and the hills of New Hampshire. Southern plantation owners, already living in rural areas, fled to mountain retreats or headed north entirely, seeking relief from heat that made their lowland properties unbearable, even for those accustomed to warm climates. What united all these destinations was a belief, part scientific, part superstitious, part simply hopeful, that certain places were inherently healthier than others. Coastal areas offered sea breezes that were thought to purify the lungs. Mountain regions provided cool temperatures and fresh air untainted by urban pollution. Springs and mineral waters promised therapeutic benefits that could strengthen the body against disease. These beliefs were not entirely wrong, as we shall explore in later sections, but they were based on incomplete understanding that often led to conclusions that seem charmingly misguided to modern ears. You watch the last of the wealthy families disappear toward the waterfront, and you are left standing in a city that suddenly feels abandoned. But of course, it is not abandoned at all. The poor remain. The working class remains. The immigrants crammed into tenement buildings remain. For them there is no escape, no ticket to safety, no summer cottage waiting with ocean breezes and cool mountain air. They will face the summer here, in streets that grow more dangerous with each passing week, and many of them will not survive to see the autumn leaves change colour. This stark division between those who could flee and those who could not would define summer in American cities for the entire 19th century and well into the 20th. It created two separate Americas, one that experienced summer as a season of leisure, health, and social advancement, and another that experienced it as a season of danger, disease, and death. Understanding this division is essential to understanding everything that follows in our story tonight. The heat presses down on you like a weight, and you realise that even imagining yourself in this time and place makes you appreciate the simple miracle of air conditioning, of public health infrastructure, of a world where summer is a season of vacations rather than evacuations. But we have only begun our journey through this strange and fascinating chapter of American history. The reasons for flight will become clearer as we explore the specific horrors that made cities so dangerous, and the destinations will come alive as we visit the resorts and retreats that welcome the wealthy refugees of summer. For now, you simply stand and watch and wonder at a world so different from our own, yet connected to us by threads of history that stretch unbroken across the centuries. The first thing that hits you is the smell. You have not even opened your eyes yet, and already your nose is delivering urgent warnings that something is terribly, profoundly wrong with the air in this place. You're standing on a street corner in Philadelphia in the summer of 1858, and what you are breathing can barely be called air at all. It is more like a thick soup of odours, each one competing for dominance, none of them pleasant, all of them combining into an olfactory assault that makes you want to hold your breath until you pass out. This was the reality of urban life in 19th century America, and it formed the foundation of everything we are discussing tonight. You cannot understand why the wealthy fled unless you first understand what they were fleeing from, and what they were fleeing from was, quite literally, the stench of progress. Let us start with the horses. By the 1860s, New York City alone was home to approximately 100,000 horses. These animals powered everything. They pulled carriages, hauled freight, delivered goods, transported passengers, and provided the muscle that made urban commerce possible. But horses, as you may have noticed if you have ever been near one, produce waste, lots of waste. Each horse deposited somewhere between 15 and 30 pounds of manure on the streets every single day. Multiply that by 100,000 horses, and you arrive at a daily deposit of somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million pounds of horse excrement landing on city streets, every day, rain or shine, summer and winter. In winter, the cold helped contain the problem somewhat. The manure froze, or at least did not decompose as rapidly, but in summer, the heat transformed those mountains of horse waste into something approaching biological warfare. The manure fermented, it liquefied, it mixed with urine, each horse also producing several gallons of that daily, and created a slurry that coated the streets in a brown-green paste that squished beneath every footstep and splashed onto skirts and trouser legs with every passing carriage. You pick your way carefully down the sidewalk, but there is no truly clean path. The crossings are particularly treacherous. Enterprising young boys have set up informal businesses at busy intersections, offering to sweep a path across the street for a penny or two. These crossing sweepers were a fixture of urban life, and their existence tells you everything you need to know about the condition of the streets. Respectable people literally could not cross from one side to the other without assistance, unless they were willing to wade through ankle-deep filth. But the horses were only the beginning. You pass an alley and instinctively turn your head away, but not quickly enough to avoid glimpsing what lies within. Garbage. Mountains of garbage. In an era before organised municipal sanitation, before garbage trucks and landfills and recycling centres, urban waste simply accumulated wherever it was convenient to dump it. Kitchen scraps, broken furniture, ashes from coal fires, dead animals, human waste from overflowing privies, all of it ended up in alleys, in vacant lots, in the gutters that lined the streets. The city had hired scavengers to collect some of this refuse, but their efforts were laughably inadequate. Historians still argue whether municipal authorities genuinely did not understand the connection between sanitation and public health, or whether they simply lacked the resources and political will to address the problem. What is clear is that American cities in the 1850s and 60s were among the filthiest places on earth, rivaling or exceeding the worst slums of European industrial centres. You pass a butcher shop, and the smell shifts to something sharper, the iron tang of blood, the sweetish rot of offal that has been sitting in the summer heat for too long. Slaughterhouses operated in the middle of residential neighbourhoods, and their waste products were disposed of in whatever manner was cheapest and most convenient. Blood ran in the gutters, bones accumulated in piles behind buildings, animal carcasses, stripped of usable meat but not properly disposed of, decomposed in plain sight. The flies that swarmed around these establishments numbered in the millions, and they did not stay confined to the source of their attraction. They spread throughout the neighbourhood, carrying whatever pathogens they had picked up along the way. Here is a particularly gruesome detail that most people do not know. The rendering industry. Dead horses, too numerous to bury and too valuable to simply abandon, were collected by rendering companies that processed the carcasses for useful materials. The bones were ground into fertilizer, the hides were tanned into leather, the fat was boiled down into tallow for candles and soap. And all of this processing, the boiling, the grinding, the stripping of flesh from bone, happened in facilities that were often located within city limits, sometimes in residential areas. The smell from these rendering plants was so powerful, so overwhelming, that residents living downwind reported being unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the inescapable stench of death and decay. You might be wondering about human waste, and the answer is somehow even more disturbing than you might expect. Indoor plumbing was a luxury that most households, even wealthy ones, did not possess until well into the latter half of the century. Instead, people used outhouses, privies, and chamber pots. The waste collected in cesspools, underground pits that were supposed to be periodically emptied, but often were not. These cesspools leaked. They overflowed. In some cases, they were located dangerously close to wells that provided drinking water, creating a contamination pathway that would be obvious to any modern public health official, but was entirely invisible to 19th century residents. The men who emptied these cesspools were called night soil men, and their work was performed, as the name suggests, under cover of darkness, both because the work was considered shameful and because daylight would have made the horrible nature of their task unbearably visible. They ladled human waste into barrels, loaded those barrels onto carts, and transported them outside the city to be used as fertilizer or simply dumped. The process was inefficient, incomplete, and utterly inadequate to the scale of the problem. Many cesspools were never emptied at all. They simply filled up and were abandoned, leaving underground reservoirs of human waste to seep into the surrounding soil and groundwater. You pause at a corner and watch a group of children playing in the street. They are barefoot, shoes are expensive, and summer heat makes them uncomfortable anyway, and their feet are splashing in the same filth that coats everything else. These children do not know that they are wading through a toxic stew of bacteria, parasites, and viruses. They do not know that the water they will drink tonight may be contaminated with the contents of a cesspool 50 feet from their tenement. They do not know that the meat their mother purchased from that butcher shop may be crawling with organisms that will send them to an early grave. They simply play, because children play, and because no one has told them that their environment is trying to kill them. The wealthy knew, or at least suspected. They may not have understood germ theory, that revolution in medical understanding was still decades away, but they could see and smell the obvious differences between their neighbourhoods and the slums. They could observe that disease struck hardest in the most crowded, most filthy areas. They could connect, in a rough and imprecise way, the conditions of a place with the likelihood of sickness and death, and so they fled. But their flight created a strange paradox. The very people who had the resources and influence to improve urban conditions were the ones who removed themselves from those conditions every summer. City governments, dominated by wealthy property owners who spent 3 or 4 months each year at distant resorts, had little personal motivation to invest in sanitation infrastructure that would primarily benefit the poor. Why spend tax money on sewer systems when you could simply leave town when the sewers overflowed? Why invest in street cleaning when the streets you walked would be the clean ones in Newport or Saratoga? This dynamic perpetuated a cycle of neglect that would not be broken until progressive reformers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began demanding change. But that change was still years away, and in the meantime the cities festered. Industrial pollution added another layer to the atmospheric assault. You pass a factory and notice black smoke pouring from its chimneys, mixing with the already heavy air to create a haze that obscures buildings more than a few blocks away. Coal was the fuel of progress, and coal smoke was its constant companion. The soot settled on everything. On buildings, on laundry hung out to dry, on faces and hands and lungs. People coughed constantly. Respiratory ailments were endemic. The sky itself, in summer, often took on a yellowish tinge that modern observers might recognise as smog. One quirky detail that reveals the era's attempted solutions: some wealthy families purchased what were called respirators, cloth masks soaked in various substances thought to filter or purify the air. Vinegar was popular, so were various herbal preparations. Whether these devices provided any actual protection is doubtful, but they offered psychological comfort to those who could afford them. The poor, of course, breathe the same air without any protection at all. You continue your walk through the city, past open gutters running with unidentifiable liquids, past vacant lots strewn with debris, past buildings so crowded that residents spill onto fire escapes, and rooftops seeking relief from the heat. This is what the wealthy were fleeing. This is why their trunks were packed so hastily, why their trains departed so reliably, why their summer colonies grew more elaborate with each passing year. They were not simply seeking pleasure, they were seeking survival in a world where the stench of progress could literally kill you. The sun beats down on the filthy streets, and you understand in a visceral way that no history book can fully convey why anyone with the means to leave would do so without a moment's hesitation. You wake in the middle of the night to the sound of someone retching violently in the room next door. The walls in this boarding house are thin, paper thin, and you can hear everything. The desperate gasping, the splash of vomit hitting the floor, the moaning that follows. By morning, you will learn that your neighbour has contracted cholera, and by the following evening, he will be dead. This is how fast it happens. This is why people are terrified. Cholera was the great nightmare of 19th century American cities, a disease so swift and so deadly that it seemed almost supernatural in its malevolence. You have heard of it, of course. Everyone has heard of it. But hearing about cholera and watching it work are two very different experiences. The disease arrived in America in 1832, travelling from Asia through Europe and across the Atlantic in the holds of immigrant ships. It struck New York first, then spread along trade routes to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, and beyond. And when it struck hard. The symptoms began innocuously enough. A bit of stomach discomfort, perhaps some mild diarrhea. But within hours the diarrhea became explosive, uncontrollable, draining the body of fluids at a rate that seemed impossible. The vomiting followed. Then came the cramps as dehydrated muscles seized and contorted. The victim's skin turned bluish as circulation failed. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Their voices became weak and raspy. And then, often within a single day of the first symptoms, they died. Medical professionals of the era described patients who ate breakfast in apparent health and were in their graves before dinner was served. The terror that cholera inspired cannot be overstated. You have to understand that people in the 1830s and 40s had no idea what caused this disease. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know that Vibrio cholerae, the responsible organism, was spreading through contaminated water supplies. They did not know that the cesspools we discussed earlier were leaking into the wells that provided their drinking water, creating a perfect cycle of infection and reinfection. All they knew was that healthy people were dying by the thousands, and no one could explain why. Theories abounded, each one more creative and more wrong than the last. Some physicians blamed atmospheric conditions, something in the summer air that created disease. Others pointed to moral failings, arguing that cholera was God's punishment for sin. This theory was particularly popular among clergy and gained traction from the observation that cholera seemed to strike hardest in the poorest, most crowded neighbourhoods that middle-class moralists associated with vice and degradation. If you lived in a slum, the reasoning went, you probably deserved what you got. But here is the thing. Cholera did not actually respect moral boundaries. It killed the virtuous and the sinful with equal efficiency. It killed children who had committed no sins at all. It killed doctors who tried to treat the sick. It killed ministers who prayed for their congregations. The moral explanation was comforting to those who wanted to believe that virtue provided protection, but it collapsed under the weight of evidence that the disease was entirely indifferent to the character of its victims. What cholera did respect to some degree was geography, and this is where the wealthy gained their advantage. Because cholera spread through contaminated water, areas with better water supplies experienced lower infection rates. Wealthy neighbourhoods, which sometimes had access to cleaner wells or could afford to purchase water from private suppliers, fared somewhat better than slums where dozens of families shared a single contaminated pump. Country estates, drawing water from rural springs and wells far from urban contamination, were safer still. The wealthy did not know the precise mechanism of this protection. They did not understand that they were avoiding contaminated water, but they noticed the pattern. Country air seemed healthier than city air. Mountain springs seemed purer than urban wells. Seaside resorts seemed safer than crowded streets. These observations, filtered through the prevailing miasma theory that we will discuss shortly, led to the logical conclusion that fleeing the city was the rational response to epidemic disease. You watch the boarding house across the street being quarantined. A yellow flag goes up, warning others to stay away. The family inside may or may not survive, the odds are not good. City authorities are fumigating the neighbourhood with burning tar and sulphur, a practice that accomplishes nothing against cholera, but provides the comforting illusion that something is being done. The smoke drifts through open windows, making healthy people cough while doing nothing to protect them from infection. Historians still argue whether the mass flights from cities during cholera epidemics actually reduced overall mortality or simply shifted deaths from one population to another. When wealthy residents fled, they sometimes carried the disease with them, introducing it to communities that might otherwise have been spared. Servants who accompanied their employers could be incubating the infection during their journey, then falling ill after arrival and spreading the disease to new populations. The railroad cars and steamships that enabled escape also enabled transmission, carrying both passengers and pathogens to distant destinations. But from an individual perspective, the calculus was clear. Staying in a city during a cholera outbreak was dangerous. Leaving was less dangerous. If you had the resources to leave, you left. It was that simple and that brutal. The 1849 epidemic was particularly devastating. It swept through American cities during the summer months, killing tens of thousands. New York alone recorded more than 5,000 cholera deaths, and the true number was almost certainly higher, as many deaths went unreported or were attributed to other causes. The city's wealthiest residents had fled weeks earlier, watching the disaster unfold from the safety of their country retreats. They read newspaper accounts of the mounting death toll. They received letters from friends who had stayed behind, and they congratulated themselves on their foresight and their fortune. One particularly haunting account from that summer describes a wealthy merchant who had delayed his departure to complete some business transactions. By the time he finally boarded a train for his family's home in the Hudson Valley, the disease had taken hold in his neighbourhood. He spent the entire journey terrified that he might be carrying the infection, that he might bring death to his wife and children along with his luggage. He arrived safely. He did not fall ill. But the psychological trauma of that journey stayed with him for years, and he never again waited until summer was fully underway before fleeing the city. Here is a quirky detail that captures the era's desperate search for protection. Cholera belts. These were wide strips of flannel or wool worn around the abdomen, supposedly to keep the stomach warm and thereby prevent the intestinal disturbance that preceded full-blown cholera. The theory was nonsense. Keeping your belly warm does nothing to prevent infection by waterborne bacteria, but cholera belts sold briskly throughout the epidemic years. Entrepreneurs marketed them with impressive claims, and frightened citizens purchased them by the thousands. Some versions were infused with camphor or other aromatic substances thought to have protective properties. Wealthy families packed them along with their summer wardrobes just in case. The cholera epidemics of the 1830s, 40s and 50s established a pattern that would persist for decades. Each summer brought fresh anxiety. Each newspaper report of intestinal illness sent shivers through polite society. Each death in the neighbourhood triggered a wave of premature departures, as families abandoned their original schedules and fled immediately. The disease had created a seasonal rhythm of fear that synchronized perfectly with the natural rhythm of summer heat, reinforcing the association between warm weather and mortal danger. By the time the 1866 epidemic struck, another devastating wave that killed thousands, the wealthy had long since internalized the lesson. Summer was dangerous. Cities were death traps. Escape was not a luxury but a necessity. The railroads that had expanded throughout the 1850s now offered multiple routes to safety, and the resorts that had developed to receive summer refugees were ready and waiting. You stand in the street as the fumigation smoke drifts past, watching neighbours eye each other with suspicion. That man coughing, is it just dust or is it something worse? That child looking pale, is she tired or is she dying? The paranoia was as contagious as the disease itself, and it drove people to irrational extremes. Some families sealed their windows against outside air, suffocating in the heat rather than risk breathing whatever was killing their neighbours. Others fled in the middle of the night, abandoning their possessions and their servants, caring only about putting distance between themselves and the invisible killer. Cholera would eventually be conquered. The identification of the bacterium in 1884, the development of clean water systems, the implementation of modern sanitation. All of these advances would render the disease a manageable problem rather than a terrifying plague. But in the 1850s and 60s, none of that had happened yet. The wealthy had only one defence: flight, and flight is what they chose. You have travelled south now to New Orleans, and the terror here has a different name. They call it yellowjack, or sometimes just the fever, and it kills with a particular cruelty that makes even cholera seem merciful by comparison. You are standing on a balcony in the French Quarter, watching the street below empty out as another epidemic summer grips the city. The wealthy have already gone. They left in May before the real heat arrived. And those who remain are either too poor to flee, too stubborn to admit the danger, or too foolish to understand what they are facing. Yellow fever was the great scourge of the American South and the port cities of the Atlantic coast. It arrived on ships from the Caribbean and South America, carried by mosquitoes that bred in the stagnant water of ships' holds and the swampy terrain of coastal lowlands. But no one knew about the mosquitoes. No one had the slightest idea that those tiny annoying insects were vectors of death. Instead, doctors and laypeople alike blame the same vague atmospheric conditions that supposedly caused every other summer disease: bad air, miasma, the effluvia of swamps and rotting vegetation. The disease earned its name from one of its most visible symptoms: jaundice. As the virus attacked the liver, victims' skin and eyes turned a sickly yellow colour that announced their condition to everyone who saw them. But jaundice was far from the worst of it. Yellow fever began with fever and chills, not unusual symptoms, easily confused with a dozen other illnesses. Then came headaches so severe that patients begged for death. Then came the muscle pain, the backache that felt like someone was driving spikes into your spine. And then, in the worst cases, came the bleeding. The virus attacked blood vessels throughout the body, causing hemorrhaging that manifested in terrifying ways. Victims vomited blood, thick black blood that had partially digested in the stomach, giving it a coffee ground appearance that doctors called black vomit. They bled from their gums, their noses, their eyes. They bled internally, their organs failing one by one as the virus destroyed the delicate tissues that kept them alive. Death, when it came, was often a relief. New Orleans suffered more than perhaps any other American city. The combination of its semi-tropical climate, its role as a major port, and its swampy terrain made it an ideal breeding ground for both mosquitoes and disease. Epidemic years were devastating. In 1853 alone, yellow fever killed nearly 8,000 residents of New Orleans, roughly 1 in every 15 people living in the city. The graveyards filled so quickly that bodies were stacked awaiting burial. The summer air, already heavy with heat and humidity, carried the sweet, sickly smell of death. The wealthy had developed their own strategies for survival, and those strategies centered entirely on escape. Plantation owners who spent winters in New Orleans packed up their entire households every spring and retreated to their country properties, where cooler temperatures and fewer mosquitoes, though they did not know about the mosquitoes, provided some protection. Merchants who had built fortunes in the city maintained summer homes in the north, travelling by steamship and rail to places like Newport or Saratoga, where yellow fever was virtually unknown. Those who could not afford such elaborate arrangements simply left town, camping with relatives in rural areas or renting cheap accommodations anywhere that was not New Orleans. Here is a detail that reveals the era's confusion about disease transmission. Many wealthy families believed that acclimation provided protection. The theory held that people who had lived in New Orleans for many years developed a natural immunity to yellow fever, while newcomers were particularly vulnerable. This belief was not entirely wrong. Survivors of yellow fever did acquire immunity, but it led to some strange practices. Families would deliberately expose their children to mild cases of the fever, hoping to get it over with and establish immunity for life. These planned exposures sometimes worked, leaving children with lifelong protection. Other times, they killed the very children they were meant to protect. The practice was controversial even at the time. Historians still argue whether deliberate exposure represented rational risk management or reckless endangerment. Parents who tried it were gambling with their children's lives, betting that a controlled infection would be survivable. Some won that bet. Others lost everything. You watch a funeral procession pass below your balcony, the third one today, and it is not yet noon. The coffin is small, child-sized, and the mourners following behind wear expressions of numb exhaustion rather than acute grief. They have seen too much death this summer. they have lost the capacity for fresh sorrow. They simply follow the coffin to the cemetery, add another body to the growing collection, and return home to wait for the next death. The mosquitoes are thick today, and you swat at them absently, not knowing that each bite could be delivering a death sentence. The connection between mosquitoes and yellow fever would not be definitively established until the early 20th century, when Walter Reed and his team conducted their famous experiments in Cuba. Until then, the insects were merely a nuisance, an annoyance that made summer evenings uncomfortable, but was never suspected of causing anything worse than itchy welts. Port cities up and down the Atlantic coast face similar threats, though none match New Orleans in sheer mortality. Philadelphia had experienced a devastating yellow fever epidemic as early as 1793, killing roughly 10% of the city's population and driving the federal government, then headquartered in Philadelphia, to flee to the countryside. That epidemic had established the precedent for summer flight among the wealthy, and subsequent outbreaks reinforced the lesson. Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and Galveston all experienced their own yellow fever summers, each one driving home the message that coastal cities in warm climates were dangerous places to spend the hot months. The economic impact was substantial. Every summer, commerce slowed or stopped entirely as those who could afford to leave did so. Ships arriving in port were sometimes quarantined for weeks, their crews dying in the harbour while waiting for permission to dock. Businesses closed their doors, unable to function without owners and key employees who had fled north. The cities that suffered most from yellow fever were also the cities that struggled most to attract permanent residents and investment, as potential migrants weighed the economic opportunities against the annual risk of death. One particularly grim quirk of yellow fever epidemics: the disease disproportionately killed young, healthy adults. Children and elderly people who contracted the disease often survived with relatively mild symptoms. But men and women in the prime of life, exactly the people that cities needed to function and grow, died at horrifying rates. This pattern was the opposite of most diseases, which typically killed the very young and the very old while sparing those in between. Yellow fever seemed almost designed to destroy the productive capacity of the communities it invaded. You retreat inside as the afternoon heat becomes unbearable, but even indoors there is no real escape. The mosquitoes follow you through open windows. The news from the streets grows worse with each passing hour. The city is emptying out, those who can leave departing on every available boat and train, those who must stay preparing for the worst. The wealthy left months ago, of course. They are in Newport or the mountains or anywhere that is not here. They are alive because they had the means to flee. Those without means remain, and they die. The summer stretches ahead like a sentence, each day bringing fresh cases, fresh deaths, fresh funerals passing beneath your balcony. You understand now why the wealthy fled, why they built elaborate summer homes hundreds of miles away, why they arranged their entire lives around avoiding these deadly months. It was not luxury, it was not indulgence, it was survival, pure and simple, purchased with money that the poor did not have and could never acquire. The mosquitoes whine around your head as the sun begins to set, and you wonder if tomorrow you will wake with a fever, with chills, with the first symptoms of a disease that might kill you within a week. This is what summer meant in the American South. This is why anyone with the resources to escape did so without hesitation or apology. You're sitting in a doctor's office in Boston, and the physician across from you is explaining why you need to leave the city immediately. His reasoning sounds scientific, authoritative, and entirely convincing. It is also, as you will eventually learn, almost completely wrong. But in 1855, this man represents the cutting edge of medical knowledge, and what he tells you reflects the best understanding that his profession can offer. The explanation goes something like this. Disease is caused by miasma, which is to say, by bad air. This bad air arises from decomposing organic matter, rotting vegetation, animal carcasses, human waste, stagnant water, and all the other filth that accumulates in urban environments. The miasma is particularly dangerous in summer, when heat accelerates decomposition and releases greater quantities of noxious vapours into the atmosphere. These vapours enter the body through breathing and through the pores of the skin, where they disrupt the natural balance of humours and produce disease. The doctor gestures toward the window, beyond which the city bakes in summer heat. The air out there, he says gravely, is poison. Every breath you take is drawing death into your lungs. You must leave, and you must leave quickly. Go to the mountains where the air is pure. Go to the seaside where ocean breezes disperse the miasma. Go anywhere but here. This was the miasma theory of disease, and it dominated medical thinking for most of the 19th century. The theory was wrong. We now know that most epidemic diseases are caused by microorganisms, not by atmospheric vapours, but it was wrong in a way that happened to produce some correct conclusions. If you believed that bad air caused disease, and if you observed that cities had worse air than the countryside, then fleeing the city was a logical response. The reasoning was flawed, but the recommendation was sound. You listen to the doctor's explanation and nod along, absorbing the scientific vocabulary that makes his argument seem irrefutable. He speaks of effluvia and morbific agents and atmospheric impurities. He references the work of European physicians who have studied miasma for decades. He cites statistics showing that mortality rates are higher in densely populated areas than in rural ones. Statistics that are accurate, even if his explanation for them is not. The miasma theory had deep roots. It dated back to ancient Greece, where Hippocrates had written about the connection between environment and health. It had been refined over centuries by physicians who observed that certain places seemed healthier than others. It explained, or seemed to explain, why epidemics struck in summer rather than winter. More decomposition, more miasma. It explained why crowded slums experienced more disease than spacious estates, more filth, more miasma. It provided a framework for understanding health and disease that was internally consistent, even if it was externally wrong. Historians still argue whether the miasma theory actually delayed the acceptance of germ theory, or whether it served as a useful stepping stone toward modern understanding. On one hand, the focus on atmospheric conditions distracted attention from the true sources of infection: contaminated water, infected individuals, disease vectors like mosquitoes. On the other hand, the miasma theory's emphasis on sanitation and clean air led to genuine improvements in public health. Cities that cleaned their streets and improved their sewer systems because they believed they were reducing miasma were actually reducing disease transmission, even if they did not understand the mechanism. The doctor hands you a pamphlet published by a medical society, outlining the dangers of summer residence in cities. The language is alarming. Remaining in the city during the heated months is to court disaster. The accumulation of noxious vapours in the atmosphere reaches its annual peak during July and August, rendering urban air unfit for human respiration. Those who have the means to seek healthier environments are strongly advised to do so, while those who must remain should take all possible precautions to minimise their exposure to morbific influences. The recommended precautions are a mix of sensible advice and superstitious nonsense. Ventilate your home thoroughly, but avoid night air, which is particularly dangerous. Drink only water from clean sources, preferably boiled. This is good advice, though the reasoning that boiling drives off morbific agents is wrong. Avoid fruits and vegetables, which may have absorbed miasma from the soil. This is bad advice that probably contributed to nutritional deficiencies and related illnesses. Burn aromatic substances to purify the air in your home. This does nothing useful but smells pleasant. You leave the doctor's office with a prescription for various tonics and a firm recommendation to depart the city as soon as possible. The prescription includes quinine, which actually does have medicinal properties, mixed with various useless substances that do nothing except lighten your wallet. The recommendation to leave is the most valuable thing the doctor has given you, not because he understands why leaving helps, but because observation has shown that it does. Here is a quirky detail that illustrates the era's approach to environmental health. Some physicians recommended specific compass orientations for summer residences. A house facing south was thought to receive too much direct sunlight, which heated the air and intensified miasma. A house facing north was healthier, as it remained cooler and received less of the supposedly dangerous solar radiation. Wealthy families choosing between summer properties sometimes consulted their doctors about the orientation of the buildings, seeking medical approval for real estate decisions. The connection between miasma theory and the summer flight of the wealthy was direct and explicit. Medical authorities told people that cities were unhealthy in summer. They explained the supposed reasons in scientific terminology that sounded authoritative and convincing. They recommended escape to healthier environments, and wealthy patients, trusting their doctors, followed this advice with the same diligence they would apply to any other medical recommendation. The resorts that developed to receive these health-seeking refugees marketed themselves in explicitly medical terms. The mountain air was described as tonic and bracing. The sea breezes were purifying and invigorating. The mineral springs offered water that was therapeutic and restorative. These claims were not merely advertising copy. They reflected genuine medical belief about the health benefits of particular environments. Doctors actually prescribed specific resorts for specific conditions, writing detailed recommendations that patients carried with them like referrals to specialists. You make arrangements to leave the city, following the doctor's advice. Your destination is a resort in the mountains, recommended for its pure air and absence of morbific influences. The journey will take a full day by train, passing through increasingly rural landscape, climbing gradually into higher elevations where the air is supposedly cleaner and safer. As you pack your trunk, you reflect on the strange circularity of the reasoning you have encountered. The doctor says the city is dangerous because of bad air. He says the countryside is safer because the air is better. How does he know the air is better? Because fewer people die there. Why do fewer people die there? Because the air is better. The logic is perfectly circular, but it is also perfectly consistent with observable reality. People who leave cities in summer do seem to survive at higher rates than those who stay. Whether the explanation is correct matters less than whether the recommendation works. This was the strange gift of miasma theory. It provided wrong reasons for doing the right thing. It created a medical and scientific justification for a behaviour, fleeing cities in summer, that happened to be protective against diseases that miasma theory did not actually understand. The wealthy who followed their doctor's advice were protecting themselves, even if neither they nor their doctors knew exactly why the protection worked. You close your trunk and prepare for departure. The summer stretches ahead, and you will spend it in the mountains, breathing air that your doctor assures you is pure and healthful. Whether that assurance is scientifically accurate matters less than the fact that it will probably keep you alive. In the strange calculus of 19th century medicine, that is good enough. You return to the city now, but not to the quiet streets of the wealthy. Instead, you find yourself in a tenement building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and the contrast with everything you have seen so far is stark, immediate, and devastating. This is where the people who cannot flee live out their summers, and this is where you begin to understand the true human cost of the annual exodus we have been exploring. The building rises 5 stories, each floor divided into apartments that would be called apartments only by the most generous stretch of that word. A single room houses an entire family: mother, father, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes boarders who pay a few cents a night to share the cramped space. The room has one window, and that window opens onto an airshaft that admits neither light nor air in any meaningful quantity. The heat is suffocating, the smell is overwhelming, and there is nowhere else to go. You climb the stairs. There is no elevator, of course, and with each floor the temperature rises. Heat accumulates at the top of buildings, and the families living on the 5th floor endure conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. The walls radiate warmth absorbed during the day. The air hangs motionless and heavy. Children lie on the floor, too listless to play, their skins slick with sweat that never quite dries. These are the people who stayed behind when the wealthy fled. These are the servants who were not brought along, the factory workers whose employers did not close for the summer, the immigrants who had nowhere else to go and no money to get there even if they did. Their summer experience was so different from the experience of Newport and Saratoga that they might as well have inhabited different planets. The death toll in these tenements during summer months was staggering. Infant mortality was particularly horrific. Babies, unable to regulate their body temperature, unable to communicate their distress in ways that adults could adequately address, died by the thousands. The phrase summer complaint, that euphemism we encountered earlier, referred primarily to the diarrheal diseases that killed infants so efficiently. Mothers who watched their children sicken and die had no understanding of what was happening, no ability to prevent it, and no resources to seek treatment that might have helped. You sit with a family in one of these apartments and they tell you their story in broken English, flavoured with the accents of a dozen different homelands. They came to America seeking opportunity. They found work in the factories and sweatshops that powered the city's economy. They saved money, sent some back to relatives in the old country, dreamed of eventually moving to better circumstances, but summer after summer their children died, and their dreams seemed to recede further with each tiny coffin. Historians still argue whether the wealthy had any moral obligation to address the conditions that made tenement life so deadly. Some argue that the wealthy were simply responding rationally to incentives, protecting their own families without owing anything to strangers. Others argue that the wealth that funded summer escapes was extracted from the labour of the very people who could not afford to flee, creating an ethical responsibility that the wealthy systematically ignored. The debate continues today, applied to contemporary versions of the same fundamental inequality. What is not debatable is the stark disparity in outcomes. Mortality statistics from 19th century American cities show massive differences between neighbourhoods, differences that correlated almost perfectly with income and class. In wealthy wards, where residents departed for the summer, and those who remained lived in spacious, well-ventilated homes, death rates were relatively low. In poor wards, where residents had no option but to stay, and conditions were barely compatible with human life, death rates soared. The city made some efforts to address the problem, though these efforts were halting and inadequate. Public health officials distributed pamphlets advising tenement residents on how to survive the summer, advice that was often useless given the constraints they faced. Keep your rooms ventilated, the pamphlet said, as if families living in airless interior apartments had any choice in the matter. Boil your water, the pamphlet said, as if families already spending most of their income on rent had fuel to spare for boiling. Avoid crowded conditions, the pamphlet said, as if families could simply choose to live in less crowded circumstances. Here is a particularly grim detail that captures the era's approach to poor children. Summer excursions. Charitable organisations arranged day trips that took tenement children to the countryside or the seashore, giving them a few hours of fresh air before returning them to their suffocating homes. These fresh air programs were well-intentioned, and probably did provide some physical and psychological benefit. But they also highlighted the fundamental injustice of a system in which wealthy children spent entire summers in healthy environments, while poor children received, at most, a few stolen hours. You watch a mother fan her infant with a piece of cardboard, trying desperately to create some movement in the stagnant air. The baby is not doing well, its breathing is shallow, its skin is flushed, its cries are weak and infrequent. This mother has already lost 2 children to summer fevers. She knows, with a certainty born of terrible experience, that she may lose this one too, but she has no money for a doctor, no way to reach cooler temperatures, no option except to sit and fan and hope and pray. The wealthy, meanwhile, are playing croquet on manicured lawns in Newport. They are sipping mineral water in Saratoga. They are breathing mountain air in the Adirondacks. They will return in September, refreshed and healthy, to find their servants and workers depleted by a summer of disease and death. They will express sympathy, perhaps, and then return to the comfortable routines of their lives, already planning next year's escape. This is not to say that wealthy families were uniformly callous. Many were genuinely unaware of the extent of suffering in the tenements. Others were aware but felt powerless to address problems that seemed overwhelming in scale. Still others did engage in charitable work, founding organisations that provided assistance to the poor and advocating for reforms that would eventually improve conditions. But the fundamental dynamic remained. Those with resources fled danger, while those without resources remained to face it. The summer sun beats down on the tenement roof, and you hear the crying of children, the coughing of the sick, the exhausted silence of adults who have nothing left to give. This is the other half of the story we're telling tonight, the half that rarely appears in the nostalgic accounts of Newport cottages and Saratoga balls. This is what made the luxury possible, and this is what the luxury ignored. You descend the stairs and emerge onto the street, where the garbage and manure we discussed earlier create their own special summer atmosphere. The wealthy have fled this too, fled the smell, fled the filth, fled everything that makes this place unbearable. They will return when the leaves turn and the temperatures drop, when the city becomes tolerable again. Until then, the poor will endure, and many of them will die, and the great machine of American inequality will grind on as it always has. You board a train now, and the world begins to change around you with remarkable speed. The locomotive pulls away from the station, leaving the crowded streets and filthy air of the city behind, and within minutes you're passing through a landscape that seems almost impossibly different from what you've just escaped. Fields stretch toward the horizon. Trees line the tracks. The air flowing through the open windows smells of grass and flowers rather than manure and industrial smoke. You're on your way to somewhere better, and the railroad is making that journey possible in ways that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. The expansion of the American railroad network in the mid-19th century transformed the geography of escape. Before the railroads, wealthy families who wanted to flee summer cities faced journeys of several days by stagecoach or steamboat. These journeys were uncomfortable, expensive, and limited to destinations accessible by existing transportation routes. A family wanting to reach the mountains might spend a week travelling, arrive exhausted and road-weary, and have barely enough summer remaining to make the trip worthwhile. The railroads changed everything. By 1860 you could board a train in New York City and reach destinations throughout the Northeast within hours. The trip to Newport, once a full day's ordeal by boat and stage, now took roughly 5 hours in reasonable comfort. The journey to Saratoga Springs, once a multi-day expedition, could be completed before dinner time. The Catskill Mountains, the Adirondacks, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, all of these formerly remote destinations suddenly became accessible for summer sojourns. You settle into your seat as the train picks up speed, and you notice the other passengers around you. They are almost uniformly wealthy, the ticket prices ensure that, and they carry the unmistakable air of people escaping rather than simply travelling. Trunks and hatboxes fill the luggage racks. Children peer out windows with excitement, while nursemaids keep watchful eyes on their charges. Ladies fan themselves against the warmth, but smile at the thought of cooler temperatures ahead. The railroad companies understood their market perfectly. They did not merely provide transportation, they provided salvation. Advertisements for summer trains emphasized health and safety rather than mere convenience. "Escape the pestilential airs of the city," one typical advertisement proclaimed. "Breathe the pure mountain breezes of the Catskills." Another promised relief from the fevers and miasmas of urban life to passengers travelling to coastal resorts. Here is a quirky detail that reveals the era's priorities. Some railroads ran special invalid cars designed specifically for passengers whose health was already compromised. These cars featured larger windows for better ventilation, more comfortable seating, and attendants trained to assist the sick. Doctors would prescribe specific destinations for specific ailments, and patients would board these invalid cars with the same seriousness they would bring to checking into a hospital. The railroad was not merely transportation, it was medical infrastructure. The expansion of the railroad network also democratized summer escape to some degree, though the democratization was limited. A middle-class family that could not afford a season at Newport might still afford a week or two at a less fashionable resort. A clerk who could not build a summer cottage might still afford a few days' board at a mountain hotel. The railroads made shorter trips economically feasible, expanding the population of summer refugees beyond the truly wealthy to include the merely comfortable. Historians still argue about the relationship between railroad development and resort development. Did resorts emerge because railroads made them accessible? Or did railroads extend to particular locations because resorts already existed there? The answer is probably both, in a feedback loop that accelerated throughout the latter half of the 19th century. A resort would become fashionable, attracting wealthy visitors. Railroad companies would extend lines to capture that traffic. The improved access would make the resort more attractive to a wider population. More visitors would arrive, more hotels would open, more rail connections would follow. You watch the landscape change outside your window as the train climbs toward higher elevations. The temperature drops noticeably. Even on this warm summer day, the mountain air is cooler than what you left behind. This simple fact of physics, that temperature decreases with altitude, was the foundation of the entire mountain resort industry. The wealthy were literally climbing above the dangerous overheated air of the lowlands, seeking refuge in the cooler upper atmosphere. The train makes a stop at a small station, and you watch passengers disembark with their luggage. A hotel omnibus waits to transport them to their final destination, and the name painted on its side identifies one of the region's famous summer establishments. The passengers are greeted by staff in smart uniforms, their baggage whisked away with practiced efficiency. Within the hour, they will be settled in comfortable rooms, breathing air that their doctors have assured them is healthful and restorative. The railroad journey itself became part of the summer experience. Wealthy families treated the trip as the first chapter of their seasonal adventure, packing picnic baskets with delicacies, settling children by windows with games and books, noting familiar landmarks that signaled progress toward their destination. The names of stations along popular routes became as familiar as the names of streets in their home neighbourhoods. Signs of progress toward health and safety. One particularly important development was the Pullman sleeping car, introduced in the 1860s and rapidly becoming standard on long-distance routes. Before Pullman cars, overnight train travel was a miserable experience, passengers dozing fitfully in upright seats, while the train jolted and swayed through the darkness. With Pullman cars, wealthy travellers could sleep in actual beds, awakening refreshed at their destination. This made longer journeys feasible, opening up destinations that were previously too remote for comfortable access. You feel the train begin to slow as it approaches your station. The journey that would have taken your grandparents several days has taken you a few hours. You will arrive at your summer residence in time for dinner, settle into your room, and awaken tomorrow to a world utterly different from the one you left behind. The railroad has made this transformation possible, collapsing distance and time in ways that reshuffled the geography of American summer. The conductor walks through the car calling your station, and you gather your belongings. Outside the window you can see the resort town taking shape, hotels rising above treetops, carriages waiting to collect arriving guests, a sense of ordered leisure that contrasts sharply with the chaos of the city you departed. You are about to enter a world created specifically for people fleeing summer danger, a world made possible by iron rails and steam engines, a world that did not exist a generation ago, and will soon seem as permanent and inevitable as the mountains themselves. You step off the train at Newport, Rhode Island, and immediately understand that you have entered another world entirely. The air here is different, salt-tinged, cool, carrying the endless whisper of ocean waves. The light is different, softer somehow, filtered through marine atmosphere that painters will spend careers trying to capture. And the people are different, not merely wealthy, but the wealthiest, the elite of America's elite, gathered in this small coastal town to spend summers in a style that would make European aristocrats envious. Newport's transformation into America's most exclusive summer resort happened gradually, then suddenly. Through the early 19th century, the town was a pleasant but unremarkable New England community known primarily for its colonial architecture and its excellent natural harbour. Wealthy families from the south had been summering there since before the Revolution, drawn by the cool ocean breezes that provided relief from the sweltering heat of their plantation homes. But the real explosion of fashionability came after the Civil War, when fortunes made in railroads, finance and industry sought appropriate places to display themselves. You walk along Bellevue Avenue and the scale of wealth on display is almost incomprehensible. The houses here are called cottages, but this is a joke that everyone understands. These are mansions, enormous, elaborate, architecturally ambitious structures that represent the combined efforts of the nation's best architects, decorators, and craftsmen. Marble imported from Italy, furniture shipped from France, gardens designed to rival Versailles, all of it assembled in a small Rhode Island town for the exclusive purpose of housing wealthy families during the summer months. The most famous of these cottages was not yet built in the era we are exploring. The Breakers, that 70-room monument to Vanderbilt excess, would not be completed until 1895, but plenty of impressive structures already line the avenue. Kingscott, built in 1839, established the Gothic revival style that would influence generations of Newport architecture. Château-sur-Mer, completed in 1852, brought French Second Empire grandeur to the American shore. Each new cottage tried to outdo its neighbours, creating an architectural arms race that would continue for decades. Here is a detail that captures the strange logic of Newport wealth. Many of these elaborate structures were occupied for only 6 to 8 weeks each year. Families would arrive in late July, open their cottages with elaborate ceremonies and parties, host the social events that define the Newport season, and depart by early September. The rest of the year, the houses sat empty, maintained by skeleton staffs who kept everything in perfect readiness for the brief weeks when the owners would return. The cost per day of occupancy was astronomical, but that was rather the point. You observe the social rituals that govern life in this peculiar community. Visiting cards are exchanged with military precision. Invitations to parties are coveted, accepted, and reciprocated according to unwritten rules that everyone seems to understand. The hierarchy of Newport society is as rigid as any European court, and violations of its protocols are punished with exclusion that can last for seasons. The women are particularly bound by these expectations. A Newport summer meant endless costume changes: morning dress, afternoon dress, dinner dress, ball gown, each requiring elaborate preparation and the assistance of multiple servants. It meant calling hours and tea parties and luncheons and dinners, an exhausting schedule of socialisation that left little time for actual rest. The supposed health benefits of the sea air were somewhat undermined by the social demands that made genuine relaxation impossible. Historians still argue whether Newport's social rigidity served any functional purpose, or whether it was merely aristocratic pretension imported from Europe. Some suggest that the elaborate rules helped manage status anxiety among the newly wealthy, providing clear guidelines for behaviour in a social world they had not been born into. Others suggest that the rules existed precisely to exclude, to identify and reject anyone who did not already know them, thereby protecting the established elite from competition by newcomers. You stroll past the casino, not a gambling establishment despite its name, but a social club that served as the centre of Newport summer life. Here tennis was played on immaculate courts, concerts were held in elegant auditoriums, and the rituals of upper-class socialisation proceeded with clockwork regularity. Membership was exclusive. Invitation to events was more exclusive still. The building itself, designed by McKim, Mead and White, was a masterpiece of shingle-style architecture that somehow managed to look both casual and enormously expensive. The ocean is never far away in Newport, and you walk down to the cliff path that winds along the shore. The views are spectacular. Blue water stretching to the horizon, waves crashing against rocks below, the smell of salt air that 19th century physicians considered therapeutic. Whatever else Newport might be, it is genuinely beautiful, and that beauty provided both justification and backdrop for the social theatre taking place in the cottages above. One quirky detail about Newport summers: the wealthy brought their horses, not just carriage horses for transportation, but riding horses, polo ponies, horses trained for various equestrian sports that were considered essential to upper-class life. These animals required their own staff, their own facilities, their own elaborate arrangements for transportation and care. A family arriving at Newport might travel with a dozen horses in addition to their human servants, creating logistics challenges that would impress a military quartermaster. You watch a parade of carriages making the afternoon circuit along Ocean Drive, a route that existed primarily to allow wealthy families to see and be seen. The drivers are in livery. The passengers are in their finest afternoon attire. The horses prance with trained precision. It is a display of wealth and status that is both entirely pointless and absolutely essential to the social function Newport served. As the afternoon fades toward evening, you return to the avenue where the cottages are beginning to light up for dinner. Inside those enormous structures, elaborate meals are being prepared by French chefs. Guests are being received in drawing rooms filled with old masters and antique furniture. The social machinery of Newport is clicking into gear for another evening of competitive hospitality. You are very far from the tenements of New York now, very far from the diseases and dangers that drove the wealthy to seek refuge. Newport is not merely an escape, it is an alternative reality, a world where summer means pleasure rather than peril, where the only dangers are social rather than medical. This is what money could buy in 19th century America. Not just safety, but a parallel universe in which safety was assumed and the business of life could proceed to higher concerns. You leave Newport now and travel northwest toward a destination that promises something different. Not social display, but physical restoration. You are heading to Saratoga Springs, New York, where mineral waters bubble up from underground aquifers, and visitors come seeking cures for every ailment imaginable. The journey takes you through pleasant countryside, past farms and small towns and rolling hills, until you arrive at a place that seems to exist somewhere between resort and hospital. Saratoga Springs had been famous for its mineral waters since the late 18th century, when indigenous peoples first showed European settlers the naturally carbonated springs that emerged from the earth in this corner of New York. The waters tasted strange, metallic, slightly bitter, fizzing with natural carbonation, but they were believed to possess remarkable healing properties. By the mid-19th century, Saratoga had developed into the most famous spa town in America, drawing visitors from across the country who sought relief from every conceivable medical complaint. You arrive at one of the grand hotels that dominate the town, and the first thing you notice is the diversity of the guests. Unlike Newport, where everyone seems cut from the same social cloth, Saratoga attracts a more varied clientele. Yes, there are wealthy socialites who come for the racing and the balls, but there are also invalids in wheeled chairs, consumptives with hollow coughs, elderly gentlemen with gout so severe they can barely walk. Saratoga is a place where the sick come hoping to become well, and the well come hoping to avoid becoming sick. The springs themselves are the main attraction, and each one is believed to possess slightly different properties. Congress spring water is prescribed for digestive complaints. Hathorn Spring is recommended for liver ailments. High Rock Spring supposedly benefits the kidneys. Visitors move between these springs with the dedication of pilgrims visiting holy sites, drinking glass after glass of mineral water in quantities that would alarm any modern physician. Here is a detail that captures the era's approach to water therapy. Some physicians prescribed as many as 20 glasses of mineral water per day. Patients would begin drinking at sunrise and continue throughout the day, their bodies processing enormous quantities of liquid that was believed to flush toxins and restore natural balance. Whether this actually helped anyone is doubtful, but the ritual itself was comforting, and the placebo effect is powerful. You take your first glass of Congress spring water, and the experience is memorable, though not exactly pleasant. The water is cold, spring-fed from deep underground, and fizzing with natural carbonation. The taste is complex, salty, metallic, slightly sulphurous with a bitter finish that makes you pucker. You're supposed to drink this slowly, contemplatively, allowing the healing properties to work their magic. You try to adopt the appropriate reverent attitude, but mostly you're thinking about when you can stop drinking and have some tea instead. The social life of Saratoga revolves around these spring rituals but extends well beyond them. The racing season draws wealthy horse enthusiasts who come to watch and wager on thoroughbreds competing at the famous track. The Congress Hall and the United States Hotel host elaborate balls that rival anything in Newport. The town's main street is lined with shops selling everything from souvenirs to diamonds, catering to visitors whose pockets are deep and whose appetite for spending seems inexhaustible. Historians still argue whether Saratoga's mineral waters actually provided any therapeutic benefit. Modern analysis shows that the waters contain various minerals, magnesium, calcium, sodium, iron, but in concentrations unlikely to produce significant medical effects. The most that can be said is that the waters were probably harmless to most people, and the routine of drinking them, combined with the rest and relaxation of a resort stay, may have provided psychological benefits that translated into improved well-being. You observe the other guests at your hotel going about their spa routines. A woman in a wheeled chair is being pushed toward the springs by an attendant, her face pale but hopeful. An elderly man walks slowly with a cane, pausing to rest on benches strategically placed along the path. The young woman, who appears perfectly healthy, sips her mineral water with an expression of determined virtue, as if each glass were a dose of particularly unpleasant medicine. The medical infrastructure of Saratoga was extensive. Doctors maintained offices in town, offering consultations to visitors who wanted professional guidance on their water regimens. Bathhouses provided mineral water soaks, believed to allow the healing substances to penetrate the skin directly. Sanitariums catered to long-term guests whose conditions required extended treatment. The town had essentially medicalized the summer vacation, turning leisure into therapy and pleasure into prescription. One quirky aspect of Saratoga life was the competitive drinking of mineral water. Guests would compare their daily consumption, boasting about the number of glasses they had managed to down. Some treated it as a test of endurance or dedication, pushing themselves to drink more than their neighbors. The spectacle of wealthy Americans forcing themselves to consume gallon after gallon of strange-tasting water, all in pursuit of better health, has a certain absurdist quality that period observers occasionally noted. You spend an afternoon at the racetrack, watching thoroughbreds compete before crowds that combine the sporting enthusiasm of athletes and the social aspirations of debutantes. The racing season was a highlight of the Saratoga calendar, drawing visitors who cared nothing for mineral water but wanted to participate in the excitement of competition and wagering. Fortunes were won and lost in a single afternoon, and the outcomes of particular races were discussed for years afterward. The evening brings a ball at Congress Hall, and you observe the strange mixture of the healthy and the sick that characterizes Saratoga society. A consumptive young man dances with determined energy, trying to prove to himself and others that his condition is improving. A woman whose doctors have sent her here for her nerves circulates through the crowd with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. A robustly healthy industrialist drinks champagne, and discusses business deals with equally robust colleagues, all of them pretending that the mineral waters are the reason for their visit. Saratoga represents something different from Newport. Not mere social display, but a genuine belief in the possibility of physical improvement through environmental change. The wealthy who came here were not just escaping urban dangers, they were actively seeking a cure for whatever ailed them. That the cures they sought were largely illusory does not diminish the sincerity of their search. They wanted to believe that somewhere, in some special place, there was water that could heal them and air that could restore them. Saratoga promised to be that place. You climb higher now, leaving the spa town behind and ascending toward the mountains that promise a different kind of healing. The Catskill Mountains rise before you, their slopes covered in dense forest, their peaks lost in clouds that drift across like visitors from another world. This is where the American tradition of mountain resort development began, and this is where you encounter one of the most remarkable hotels of the 19th century, the Catskill Mountain House. The Mountain House perches on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Hudson Valley, and the view from its piazza is so spectacular that it became one of the most famous scenes in American landscape painting. Thomas Cole painted it. Frederick Church painted it. Jasper Francis Cropsey painted it. The Hudson River School, that distinctly American approach to landscape art, found some of its most iconic subjects in the views from this extraordinary location. If Newport was about social display and Saratoga about medicinal waters, the Catskill Mountain House was about something harder to define but equally powerful: the spiritual and aesthetic experience of American nature. You arrive after a journey that involves train, steamboat, and finally a carriage that climbs the narrow mountain road with alarming switchbacks and steep drops. The journey itself is part of the experience, the gradual transition from civilization to wilderness, from the crowded flatlands to the rarefied heights. When you finally emerge onto the hotel grounds and see the view for yourself, you understand immediately why people endure the difficult journey. The Hudson River sparkles far below, a silver ribbon winding through a valley of intense green. The Berkshire Mountains rise on the distant eastern horizon. The sky seems bigger up here, as if the altitude has somehow expanded the visible universe. And the air, that famous mountain air, fills your lungs with each breath, cool and clean and scented with pine. The hotel itself is a remarkable structure. A Greek revival temple perched improbably on the edge of a cliff, its white columns gleaming against the dark forest backdrop. The design was deliberate, intended to suggest the meeting of classical civilization and American wilderness. Guests could sit on the enormous piazza, gazing at the sublime landscape, and feel themselves participating in something grand and significant. Here is a detail that captures the mountain house experience: sunrise viewing. Guests would wake before dawn, an almost unheard of concession for wealthy vacationers, and gather on the piazza to watch the sun rise over the Connecticut hills. The hotel staff would arrange chairs and provide blankets against the morning chill. As the first light touched the valley below, illuminating successive layers of landscape in shades of gold and pink and orange, guests would sit in reverent silence, experiencing what many described as a religious or transcendent moment. The health benefits of mountain air were taken very seriously. Physicians prescribed mountain resorts for patients with respiratory conditions, believing that the higher altitude and cleaner atmosphere would strengthen weakened lungs. Tuberculosis patients in particular were sent to mountain retreats, where they were expected to spend hours outdoors, breathing deeply, allowing the healing air to work its magic. The medical theory was wrong. Mountain air does not cure tuberculosis, but the practice of sending patients to beautiful, peaceful locations may have provided psychological benefits that improved quality of life, even if they did not extend it. Historians still argue whether the mountain house clientele genuinely appreciated the natural beauty around them, or merely used it as backdrop for the same social activities they would have pursued anywhere. The answer is probably both. The hotel hosted balls and dinners and all the usual social entertainments, but it also offered something that Newport and Saratoga could not: an encounter with American wilderness that was both comfortable and profound. You spend an afternoon hiking one of the mountain trails, following paths that have been carefully designed to combine scenic interest with reasonable difficulty. The forest closes around you, dense and green and utterly silent except for bird calls and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. You emerge at a waterfall, one of several in the region that had become tourist attractions, and stand watching the water cascade over rocks into a pool below. This experience, the combination of physical exertion, natural beauty, and peaceful solitude, was something new in American life. Before the mountain resorts, wealthy Americans had not typically sought wilderness as a source of pleasure or restoration. The wilderness was something to be conquered, civilized, transformed into productive farmland or profitable timber. But the Romantic movement, flowing from Europe through American literature and painting, was changing how educated people thought about nature. Wilderness was no longer just an obstacle, it was a source of spiritual renewal. One quirky detail about the Mountain House: it had its own artists in residence. Painters would spend entire summers at the hotel, working on landscapes commissioned by guests, or simply pursuing their own artistic visions. These artists became minor celebrities among the summer visitors, their work in progress attracting curious observers who wanted to watch creativity unfold. The presence of artists reinforced the idea that the Mountain House was not merely a resort but a cultural institution, a place where American art and American nature came together. You return to the hotel as evening approaches, taking your place on the piazza to watch the sunset. The valley below is already filling with shadow, but the western peaks still catch the golden light. Other guests gather around you, some chatting quietly, others simply watching in contemplative silence. The Mountain House had discovered something important, that Americans, even wealthy Americans, accustomed to European travel and sophisticated entertainment, could be deeply moved by their own country's natural beauty. The hotel would operate for over a century, welcoming generations of summer visitors who climbed the mountain seeking escape, restoration, and perhaps transcendence. Its decline would come only with the rise of the automobile, which made more distant and exotic destinations accessible. But in its heyday, the Catskill Mountain House represented something essential about American summer culture: the belief that getting away from the city meant not just avoiding disease, but encountering something positive and transformative in the natural world. You descend from the mountains now and travel south along the coast to a different kind of resort, one that carries the weight of presidential endorsement and national significance. Cape May, New Jersey, claims to be the oldest seaside resort in America, and its guest registers read like a history of American political leadership. You're walking beaches where presidents have walked, staying in hotels where the decisions that shaped the nation were sometimes discussed over dinner. The connection between Cape May and American presidents began early and continued throughout the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln visited before his presidency. Ulysses S. Grant made Cape May a regular summer destination during and after his time in the White House. Benjamin Harrison, Chester Arthur, Franklin Pierce. The list of chief executives who sought refuge on these beaches is remarkable. At certain moments in the 19th century, Cape May functioned almost as a shadow capital, a place where political conversations continued even as our official Washington emptied out for the summer. Why Cape May? The answer involves geography, timing, and a bit of historical accident. The resort was close to Philadelphia, which served as the de facto capital region before Washington, D.C., fully developed, and it was relatively accessible from New York as well. It developed early, establishing a critical mass of fashionable visitors before competing resorts could catch up. And its beaches were genuinely pleasant, wide, sandy, washed by gentle waves that made swimming possible even for guests who could not really swim. You check into one of the large hotels that line the beachfront, establishments designed to accommodate hundreds of guests in substantial comfort. The architecture here is different from Newport. Less marble grandeur, more Victorian gingerbread, ornate wooden trim painted in cheerful colours that catch the seaside light. The effect is festive rather than imposing, suggesting a place meant for enjoyment rather than social intimidation. Here is a detail that captures Cape May's particular character: the bathing costumes. Because Cape May's beaches were actually used for bathing, swimming, or at least splashing in the waves, the resort developed an elaborate culture around appropriate beach attire. Women wore bathing costumes that seemed preposterously modest to modern eyes. Full coverage outfits including bloomers, stockings, shoes, and sometimes even weights sewn into hems to prevent embarrassing flotation. Men had somewhat more freedom, but were still expected to cover themselves decently. Bathing machines, wheeled changing rooms that could be rolled into the water, allowed guests to enter the ocean without exposing themselves to public view during the transition from clothed to costumed. The practical health benefits of sea bathing were widely promoted by physicians of the era. Salt water was believed to have therapeutic properties, strengthening the skin, improving circulation, invigorating the entire system. The practice of actually entering the ocean, rather than simply looking at it from a safe distance, marked Cape May as a more active, health-focused resort than some of its competitors. Guests were expected to bathe daily, treating each immersion as a medical treatment rather than mere recreation. Historians still argue whether the presence of presidents at Cape May reflected genuine preference or political calculation. Some suggest that these men simply enjoyed the beach and found Cape May convenient. Others suggest that they chose Cape May specifically because it was neither too exclusive, which might seem elitist, nor too vulgar, which might seem undignified. The resort occupied a middle ground that was politically comfortable for men who had to appeal to broad constituencies while maintaining appropriate social status. You spend a morning on the beach, watching the elaborate rituals of 19th century seaside leisure. Ladies sit under parasols, their pale skin carefully protected from the sun that we now know provides important vitamin D but that they believed would ruin their complexions. Children build sand structures under the watchful eyes of nurses. Men wade into the water with an air of manly determination, demonstrating their vigour by subjecting themselves to cold waves. The presidential connection gave Cape May something valuable, a sense of national significance that elevated it above mere pleasure-seeking. When you stayed at Cape May, you were not just escaping summer dangers, you were participating in American public life at its highest level. The conversations in the hotel lobbies might touch on tariffs and territories. The gentleman nodding to you over breakfast might be a senator or a cabinet secretary. The resort served as a meeting place for the political and commercial elite who governed the nation. One quirky detail about Cape May: the arrival of the railroad brought not just convenience but crisis. When trains made the beach accessible to middle-class visitors who could not previously afford the journey, established guests worried about the social character of their favourite resort. The response was the development of exclusive sections of Cape May, private areas where the elite could segregate themselves from the newly arriving masses. This pattern, democratization of access followed by the creation of new exclusivity, would repeat itself throughout American resort history. You take an afternoon drive along the shore past rows of summer cottages in various stages of architectural ambition. Some are simple beach houses, others aspire to the grandeur of Newport. The variety reflects Cape May's identity as a resort that served multiple classes of wealthy visitors, from the truly rich to the merely comfortable. Unlike Newport's rigid exclusivity, Cape May offered gradations of status that allowed a broader range of families to participate in summer escape. As evening approaches, you dress for dinner, a formal affair even at the seaside, with gentlemen in evening wear and ladies in gowns that seem impractical given the sand that finds its way into everything. The dining room is large and bright, designed to accommodate the hotel's capacity crowd of summer visitors. You take your seat and look around at the assembled guests: politicians and businessmen, society matrons and their daughters, writers and artists who have come seeking inspiration. Cape May represents something different from the other resorts we have visited. Not pure social display like Newport, not medical tourism like Saratoga, not nature worship like the Catskills. It is in some ways the most purely American of the summer destinations, democratic in aspiration if not quite in reality, patriotic in association, practical in orientation. The presidents who walked these beaches were not seeking transcendence. They were seeking rest, relief from summer heat, and perhaps a few weeks of relative normalcy before returning to the burdens of office. You travel north now, far north, into territory that barely seems like America at all. The Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York rise around you in endless waves of dark green forest, lakes scattered between them like fragments of sky fallen to earth. This is wilderness on a scale that makes the Catskills seem like a city park, and the summer visitors who come here are seeking something that cannot be found in more civilized resorts: authentic encounter with untamed nature, packaged for comfortable consumption. The great camps of the Adirondacks represent a peculiarly American contradiction. Wilderness mansions, rustic palaces, roughing it in style. The wealthy families who built these establishments wanted the experience of nature without actually experiencing its inconveniences. They wanted log cabins, but log cabins with crystal chandeliers and French-trained chefs. They wanted forest isolation, but forest isolation with butler service and hot running water. The result was a building tradition unlike anything else in American architecture. Deliberately primitive structures that cost more than most people would ever see in their lifetimes. You approach one of these camps by boat, crossing a lake whose shores show no sign of human habitation except for the dock where you will land. The main lodge rises among the trees, its log construction suggesting frontier simplicity, while its scale suggests something very different. Inside, the great hall features a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, trophy heads of deer and moose and bear mounted on walls that extend 2 stories to a cathedral ceiling. The furniture is made of bent birch twigs and leather, deliberately crude in design but expertly crafted by artisans who charged premium prices for their rustic work. The camp belongs to one of the great names of American industry, a Vanderbilt or a Morgan or a Rockefeller, the exact identity obscured by the discretion that governed Adirondack society. These men spent their working lives in mahogany-panelled offices and marble-floored mansions. Their summer retreat to the wilderness was meant to provide contrast, to restore vigour that civilized life supposedly depleted. They hunted deer, they caught fish. They told themselves stories about self-reliance and American simplicity while servants prepared their meals and laundered their flannel shirts. Here is a detail that captures the absurdity and appeal of great camp life: the hunting guides. These men, usually locals who knew the forest intimately, were hired to lead wealthy visitors on hunting and fishing expeditions. The guides did most of the actual work, locating game, managing boats, cooking over campfires, but the wealthy guests got the credit, and, more importantly, the trophies. A New York banker could return to the city with stories of having shot a 12-point buck, without mentioning the guide who had tracked the animal, positioned the hunter, and probably could have made the shot blindfolded. The health benefits of Adirondack summers were promoted with particular vigour for one condition: tuberculosis. The belief that mountain air could cure or at least arrest the progress of this devastating disease led to the development of sanitariums throughout the Adirondacks, where consumptive patients lived outdoors year-round, even in winter. The cure cottage movement, as it was called, was based on faulty medical theory but attracted desperate patients who would try anything. Wealthy tuberculosis sufferers built their own cure cottages, creating a population of semi-permanent residents who had come seeking health and stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Historians still argue whether the Adirondack wilderness experience genuinely restored the vigour of exhausted industrialists or merely provided them with stories to tell at dinner parties. The men who built these camps worked extraordinarily long hours, made decisions affecting thousands of workers, carried stress that would be recognised today as profoundly unhealthy. A few weeks in the forest, however luxurious, seems unlikely to have compensated for the toll that their lives extracted. But the belief in restoration was sincere, and the camps themselves became important to their owners in ways that transcended rational analysis. You spend a day fishing on one of the countless lakes, your guide handling the boat while you attempt to master the art of casting a line. The silence is remarkable. No traffic, no crowds, no industrial noise, just water lapping against the hull, wind rustling through pines, the occasional splash of a fish rising. You begin to understand why men who could afford anything chose to spend their summers in places like this. The contrast with urban life was not just physical but psychological, offering relief from the constant stimulation and stress of commercial civilization. One quirky detail about Adirondack camp culture: the competition to appear most rustic. Guests who would never dream of wearing anything but the finest tailored clothing in the city donned elaborate costumes of flannel and buckskin in the forest. They compared their rough accommodations with pride, boasting about how primitive their own camps were while secretly enjoying every comfort that money could buy. The entire performance was, in some ways, a joke that everyone understood and nobody acknowledged. The meals at the camp contradict everything the log cabin aesthetic suggests. Dinner is served on fine china, prepared by a chef who trained in Paris. The wine comes from cellars that rival any restaurant in New York. The courses proceed with formal precision, waiters in livery moving silently between tables. You're eating game that was supposedly shot on the property, though the practical challenges of supplying enough wild meat to feed several dozen guests have probably been addressed through more mundane sources. As night falls, you sit on the porch and listen to sounds you never hear in the city: owls calling, wind through branches, the splash of some creature in the lake below. The darkness is absolute in a way that urban dwellers have almost forgotten was possible. The stars blaze overhead with a brilliance that makes city skies seem pathetic by comparison. You understand, in this moment, why people built these elaborate rustic fantasies. They were seeking something real, even if they had to fake parts of it to find it. You travel east now, toward the coast of Maine, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against rocky shores with a violence that makes the genteel beaches of Cape May seem almost absurd. This is Bar Harbor, on Mount Desert Island, and the wealthy visitors who have discovered this place are not seeking gentle relaxation. They are seeking drama, the drama of waves against rock, of fog rolling in from the sea, of a landscape that reminds them that nature is powerful and humanity is small. Bar Harbor's development as a summer resort followed a pattern we have seen before. Artists and writers came first, attracted by the spectacular scenery, and the wealthy followed. Thomas Cole, who helped establish the Catskill Mountain House as an artistic landmark, also painted Mount Desert Island, and his images circulated among collectors who became curious about this remote corner of New England. Writers described the island's unusual combination of mountain and sea, its European atmosphere, its sense of existing outside ordinary American geography. The wealthy, always seeking new stages for their summer dramas, took notice. By the 1880s, Bar Harbor had become one of the most fashionable summer destinations in America, rivaling Newport for social prestige while offering a completely different kind of experience. Newport was manicured lawns and formal gardens. Bar Harbor was rocky cliffs and pine forests. Newport was afternoon carriage drives along smooth roads. Bar Harbor was challenging hikes up Cadillac Mountain. Newport attracted families who wanted to be seen. Bar Harbor attracted families who wanted to feel that they were doing something more adventurous than mere social climbing. You arrive by steamship. The railroad had not yet reached the island in the era we are exploring, and your first view of the harbour is memorably dramatic. The village rises from the water's edge, climbing hillsides that are dark with evergreen forest. Behind the village, mountains loom with surprising height for this coastal region. The water of the harbour is deep blue, almost black, reflecting a sky that changes constantly as maritime weather systems move through. Here is a detail that captures Bar Harbour's distinctive appeal: the buckboard rides. Guests would hire these simple horse-drawn carriages to take them along the island's carriage roads, which had been built specifically for scenic touring. The roads wound through forests and along cliff tops, offering views that changed with every turn. The roughness of the rides, buckboards had no springs to speak of, was part of the appeal, distinguishing the experience from the smooth comfort of Newport's carefully graded avenues. The summer cottages of Bar Harbor were different from those of Newport as well. They were built of local materials, granite and wood, and designed to harmonise with the landscape rather than dominate it. The style was sometimes called cottage vernacular or shingle style, emphasising natural textures and earthy colours. Some estates were enormous, spreading across acres of shoreline property. But even the largest aimed for a kind of rustic elegance that made Newport's marble palaces seem ostentatious. Historians still argue whether Bar Harbor's visitors genuinely appreciated the natural environment or merely treated it as a more spectacular backdrop for the same social activities that animated every other summer resort. The evidence suggests a mixture of motivations. Serious hikers and nature enthusiasts did visit the island, exploring its trails and studying its flora and fauna. But the majority of summer visitors probably spent more time at dinner parties than on mountain summits. You spend a morning climbing Cadillac Mountain, the highest point on the eastern seaboard of the United States. The trail is challenging but well marked, and you pass other climbers, some clearly experienced, others struggling in inappropriate footwear and elaborate costumes. At the summit, the view extends in all directions. Islands scattered across the bay, the mainland a blue haze to the west, the open ocean stretching endlessly to the east. You're standing at a vantage point that would become famous in the 20th century as the first place in the United States to see the sunrise, though this fact was not yet widely known. One quirky aspect of Bar Harbor society, the presence of famous scientists. Unlike Newport, which attracted primarily financial and social elites, Bar Harbor drew visitors from academic and intellectual circles. A marine biological laboratory had been established on the island, attracting researchers who studied the rich marine ecosystems of the Maine coast. Summer visitors might find themselves dining next to distinguished professors, engaging in conversations about topics more substantial than the usual resort small talk. The fog that frequently shrouds Mount Desert Island gave it an atmosphere unlike any other American resort. On foggy mornings, the entire landscape transformed, familiar shapes becoming mysterious and slightly threatening. Sound carried strangely through the mist. You might hear a bellboy miles offshore as clearly as voices in the next room. Visitors from clearer climates found the fog disorienting at first, then enchanting. It added an element of the sublime to a landscape that was already dramatically beautiful. You spend an afternoon exploring the shore, scrambling over rocks slick with seaweed, watching waves crash against formations that have been sculpted by centuries of Atlantic storms. The power of the ocean here is undeniable. You can feel the spray on your face, taste the salt, hear the thunder of water against stone. This is not the domesticated nature of the Catskills, or even the managed wilderness of the Adirondacks. This is nature that demands respect, that could kill you if you were careless, that reminds you that human ambition and human wealth mean nothing to the forces that shape the planet. As evening approaches, you return to your hotel and prepare for dinner. The social rituals of Bar Harbor are less elaborate than those of Newport, but still substantial. Guests dress for dinner and observe the protocols of polite society. But the conversation is more likely to touch on the day's hiking adventures or the morning's sailing expedition than on the complex hierarchies of social standing that dominate Newport gatherings. You travel south again now, to a destination that might seem surprising given everything we have discussed about escaping urban dangers. You're heading to Long Branch, New Jersey, and this seaside resort is everything that Newport is not. Loud, flashy, democratic, and unapologetically devoted to pleasure in its most immediate forms. If Newport is opera, Long Branch is vaudeville. If Newport is champagne, Long Branch is cold beer. And yet presidents come here too, blurring the lines between high society and popular entertainment. Long Branch emerged as a resort in the decades following the Civil War, growing rapidly as railroad connections made it accessible to visitors from New York, Philadelphia, and points inland. Unlike Newport, which maintained strict social barriers, Long Branch welcomed anyone with the price of a ticket. Day trippers from the city mixed with wealthy seasonal residents. Gambling establishments operated alongside respectable hotels. The beach was crowded with bathers of every social class, their bathing costumes distinguishing the refined from the common, but not separating them entirely. The result was a resort atmosphere unlike anything at the destinations we have previously visited. You walk along the boardwalk, one of America's first, and the sensory experience is overwhelming. Music pours from competing venues. Vendors hawk food, souvenirs, amusements of every kind. The smell of fried food mingles with salt air and the perfume of passing ladies. Children run and shout, adults laugh and flirt. The serious health-seeking atmosphere of Saratoga seems very far away. Here is a detail that captures Long Branch's distinctive character: the gambling. While other resorts banned or carefully concealed games of chance, Long Branch embraced them openly. The famous gambling houses along Ocean Avenue attracted visitors who had no interest in sea bathing or healthful air, but were drawn by the prospect of winning or losing substantial sums. Professional gamblers worked the tables, and occasionally the newspapers reported on spectacular wins or devastating losses that added to the resort's colourful reputation. Presidents came to Long Branch despite, or perhaps because of, this atmosphere. Ulysses S. Grant, who we encountered earlier at Cape May, became even more closely associated with Long Branch, where he maintained a summer cottage for many years. James Garfield was at Long Branch when he died from wounds received in an assassination attempt, making the resort a site of national mourning. Chester Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley all spent time at the resort, lending it a presidential imprimatur that seemed somewhat incongruous with its gambling halls and popular entertainments. The explanation for this presidential presence involves politics as much as preference. Long Branch was accessible to voters and journalists in ways that more exclusive resorts were not. A president who summered at Newport might seem aristocratic and out of touch. A president who summered at Long Branch demonstrated that he was a man of the people, comfortable in democratic spaces. The gambling and popular amusements that might have seemed undignified were actually political assets, suggesting an approachable leader rather than an isolated aristocrat. Historians still argue whether Long Branch represented the democratization of summer leisure, or merely its commercialization. On one hand, the resort did make seaside vacationing accessible to middle-class families who could never have afforded Newport or Bar Harbor. On the other hand, much of what made Long Branch distinctive, the gambling, the spectacles, the relentless pursuit of profit, reflected commercial interest rather than democratic ideals. The crowds on the boardwalk were not citizens exercising their rights, but consumers spending their money. You spend an afternoon at the racetrack, another of Long Branch's famous attractions. Horse racing here has none of the aristocratic pretensions of Saratoga. It is a frankly commercial entertainment, designed to separate visitors from their money as efficiently as possible. The crowds are enthusiastic and diverse. The betting is heavy. When a race concludes, winners celebrate loudly while losers trudge toward the exit or toward the next race and the next wager. One quirky detail about Long Branch: the actors. Theatre celebrities of the era maintained summer homes in the resort, and their presence added glamour and excitement to the social scene. You might spot a famous actress on the boardwalk surrounded by admirers. You might attend a party where the entertainment included performances by stars of the New York stage. This blending of theatrical and social life gave Long Branch a distinctive flavour. More performance, more spectacle, more explicit entertainment than the subtle social theatre of Newport. The beach at Long Branch is wide and busy, nothing like the exclusive stretches of sand at more refined resorts. Bathing machines line the waterfront, and the water is full of swimmers of varying skill and modesty. Families spread blankets on the sand. Entrepreneurs offer rides on small boats, promising views of the famous cottages from the water. Everything is for sale, everything has a price, and nothing pretends to be anything other than what it is. You watch the sunset over the ocean, surrounded by crowds that show no inclination to disperse as darkness approaches. The evening brings new entertainments, concerts, theatrical performances, illuminations along the boardwalk. Long Branch does not wind down at night. It changes character, becoming, if anything, more energetic and more determinedly pleasurable. This is what summer escape looked like for Americans who were not part of the social elite, or who simply preferred pleasure to pretension. Long Branch offered the same basic benefits as Newport: cool ocean breezes, escape from urban heat and disease, without the rigid social requirements. You did not need to know which fork to use or how to leave a calling card. You needed only money and the desire to spend it. In its own democratic way, Long Branch represented the American dream applied to leisure. Anyone could come, anyone could participate, and the main qualification for membership was the ability to pay the price of admission. You step back now from the specific resorts and consider something that all of them shared: an approach to architecture that expressed the peculiar values and anxieties of summer escape. The buildings of the summer world, hotels, cottages, casinos and bathhouses, developed their own distinctive styles, and understanding these styles helps us understand what the wealthy were seeking when they fled the cities. The most striking feature of summer architecture was its relationship to the word cottage. In ordinary English, a cottage is a small, modest dwelling, the home of a peasant or a labourer perhaps, or a romantic retreat for those seeking simplicity. In the vocabulary of summer resorts, a cottage was something entirely different. The Breakers in Newport, which we mentioned earlier, was called a cottage. Kingscote was called a cottage. Structures with 70 rooms and staffs of 30 servants were called cottages. The vocabulary was a kind of performance, a pretense that the enormous wealth on display was actually modest and unpretentious. This linguistic game reflected deeper anxieties about wealth and social status in American society. The country had been founded on principles of equality. An ostentatious display of wealth conflicted with those principles, at least theoretically. By calling their mansions cottages, wealthy families could participate in the American tradition of understatement, suggesting that they were not so very different from ordinary citizens. The fact that no one was actually fooled did not diminish the importance of the performance. It was the gesture that mattered. Here is a detail that reveals the architectural logic of summer building: the porch. Summer cottages and resort hotels devoted enormous attention to porches, verandas and piazzas, outdoor spaces that mediated between inside and outside, between the protected interior and the dangerous but enticing natural world. These porches were designed for sitting, for watching, for displaying oneself to passing observers. They were stages for the performance of leisure, places where the activity of doing nothing could be conducted with appropriate ceremony. The famous resorts developed distinctive architectural characters that distinguished them from one another and from the homes their visitors occupied during the rest of the year. Newport's cottages drew on European models, Italian Renaissance palaces, French chateaux, English manor houses, but adapted these models for seaside settings and summer use. Bar Harbour's shingle-style houses emphasised natural materials and organic forms that harmonised with the rocky Maine landscape. Long Branch's buildings were more straightforwardly commercial, designed to accommodate as many paying guests as possible, rather than to express refined aesthetic ideals. Historians still argue whether the architecture of summer resorts reflected genuine artistic vision or merely the conspicuous consumption of the wealthy. The architects involved, including some of the most talented designers of the era like Richard Morris Hunt and McKim, Mead and White, certainly approached their commissions as serious artistic challenges, but the commissions themselves were driven by competition among wealthy clients who wanted to outdo their neighbours. The result was architecture that served social and competitive functions, even as it achieved genuine aesthetic distinction. You tour one of the great Newport cottages, moving through rooms that seem designed more for effect than for actual habitation. The entrance hall is calculated to impress, with marble floors and a grand staircase leading upward into mysteries that guests are not permitted to penetrate. The drawing room is vast, furnished with pieces that would fill a museum, arranged to demonstrate the owner's taste and resources. The dining room can seat 40 guests at a single table, though the family rarely entertains on such a scale. Each room is a statement, and the house as a whole is an argument about the importance and worthiness of its owners. One quirky detail about summer architecture: the servants' quarters. While the family spaces were designed for impression and display, the servants' spaces were designed for efficiency and invisibility. Hidden staircases allowed staff to move between floors without encountering guests. Service corridors ran behind the public rooms, permitting food and supplies to reach their destinations without disrupting the theatrical effect of the main spaces. The architecture enforced a strict separation between those who were seen and those who served, a physical manifestation of the class distinctions that governed every aspect of summer life. The resort hotels faced different challenges, accommodating hundreds of guests rather than single families. They developed their own architectural traditions: long corridors, public rooms of enormous scale, dining halls that could seat small armies. The Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga, at its peak, could accommodate 1,800 guests and featured a main corridor that stretched an entire city block. These hotels were small cities, self-contained worlds with their own newspapers, orchestras and social hierarchies. You stand on the porch of a summer cottage, a real cottage this time, a modest structure that actually deserves the name, and look out at the architectural fantasy spread before you. The grand mansions march along the avenue, each one proclaiming its owner's wealth and taste. The vocabulary of architecture speaks as clearly as any newspaper. Here is money. Here is power. Here is the ability to escape the dangers that ordinary people must face. The architecture of summer escape would evolve as the century progressed, influenced by changing tastes and changing technologies. Air conditioning would eventually make summer in the city tolerable, reducing the health imperative for escape. Automobiles would democratize access to distant destinations, eroding the exclusivity of railroad-dependent resorts. The great cottages of Newport would become museums or bed and breakfasts, their original functions obsolete. But in the era we are exploring, the architecture expressed exactly what its builders intended: the triumph of wealth over danger, comfort over risk, civilization over nature. You settle into the rhythms of summer society now, learning the unwritten rules that govern life in these exclusive communities. The calendar is packed with obligations disguised as pleasures, and the social machinery operates with a precision that would impress any factory manager. Welcome to the performance of leisure, where relaxation requires as much planning and effort as any business enterprise. The day begins early, despite the supposedly relaxed atmosphere. Breakfast is served at a fixed hour, and arriving late is a minor social offence. The morning is devoted to healthful activity, bathing, riding, perhaps a game of tennis for the athletically inclined. These activities are not merely recreational, they are displays of vigour and vitality that communicate social messages. A family that swims demonstrates physical competence. A gentleman who rides well demonstrates that he can afford horses and the time to master them. Even exercise is competitive. The late morning brings calling hours, a ritual that seems incomprehensible to modern observers but was absolutely essential to summer social life. You put on appropriate dress. Calling costume was a distinct category, neither too formal nor too casual, and set out to leave your calling card at the homes of those you wish to acknowledge. If the person you're calling upon is receiving visitors, you may be admitted for a brief conversation. If not, you leave your card in a silver tray by the door, your visit recorded for future reference. The cards accumulate, evidence of social connections that are being maintained, created, or contested. Here is a detail that captures the complexity of the calling system: the turned corners. A calling card left with one corner turned down indicated a personal visit. Different corners turned indicated different messages: that the call was for a specific family member, that the visitor was leaving town and wanted to say goodbye, that the visitor was offering condolences for some misfortune. Reading the turned corners required knowledge that everyone assumed and no one explicitly taught. Newcomers to summer society often made embarrassing mistakes, turning the wrong corners and sending unintended messages. Luncheon might be taken at a club or a neighbour's cottage, depending on invitations received and social obligations owed. The meal itself was substantial, multiple courses, served with appropriate wines, and the conversation was expected to be light and amusing. Discussing business was considered vulgar. Discussing anything too serious was considered tiresome. The ideal was effortless charm, the appearance that one found the whole social machinery delightful rather than exhausting. The afternoon offered more structured activities: carriage drives along scenic routes, yacht races in the harbour, croquet or archery on manicured lawns. These activities were opportunities to see and be seen, to display sporting costumes and equipment, to demonstrate social connections by appearing in the right places with the right people. A lady who drove out in a particularly elegant carriage was making a statement. A gentleman whose yacht won a race was accumulating social capital that would be spent in subsequent interactions. Historians still argue whether summer society provided genuine pleasure to its participants or was experienced primarily as obligation and stress. Letters and diaries from the period suggest that responses varied. Some women found the endless socializing exhausting and wrote wistfully of quiet days at home. Others thrived on the attention and activity, viewing summer as the highlight of the social year. Men seem to have had more freedom to escape the social machinery when they wished, retreating to clubs or sporting activities that excluded women. You dress for dinner, a serious undertaking that requires at least an hour and the assistance of servants. The evening gown is chosen with care because the same dress cannot be worn twice, to the same event without comment. Jewels are selected to complement the gown and to demonstrate wealth without appearing vulgar. Hair is dressed elaborately, a process that alone requires the better part of an hour. By the time you descend for dinner, you have transformed yourself into a work of art, a carefully composed statement of taste, status, and intention. One quirky detail about summer dinner parties: the placement, where guests sat at dinner communicated their social standing with painful clarity. The hostess and host occupied the ends of the table, with the most honoured guests seated nearest them. The middle of the table, below the salt in the traditional phrase, was reserved for those of lesser importance. Arriving at a dinner party and discovering your place card in an unflattering position was a social wound that might sting for days. After dinner came additional entertainments, music perhaps, or cards, or dancing at larger gatherings. The evening might extend well past midnight, with guests departing only when propriety absolutely required. The next morning the cycle would begin again: breakfast, calling hours, luncheon, afternoon activities, dinner, an endless round that continued throughout the summer season. You lie in bed at night, exhausted from the effort of relaxation, and wonder how anyone sustains this pace for months at a time. The answer is that many did not sustain it, at least not happily. Nervous exhaustion was common among summer society's participants, particularly women, who bore the heaviest burden of social performance. Doctors prescribed rest cures for patients whose symptoms we would recognize today as anxiety and depression. The pursuit of health through summer escape created its own forms of illness, as the stress of constant social performance took its toll. This was the price of privilege, not just wealth, but the obligation to display it, not just escape, but the expectation of endless performance. The summer season offered relief from urban dangers, but replaced them with different dangers: social embarrassment, status anxiety, the constant fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. The wealthy who fled cholera and yellow fever found themselves in a different kind of epidemic, one that attacks self-esteem rather than the body but could be equally devastating in its effects. You turn your attention now to the people who made summer escape possible, the servants who travelled with wealthy families, who maintained the great cottages, who prepared the elaborate meals and laundered the endless changes of clothing. Their story is usually invisible in accounts of Gilded Age summers, but without them, nothing we have discussed would have been possible. A wealthy family arriving at their summer cottage brought a substantial staff. The butler supervised the male servants and managed the household's most formal functions. The housekeeper supervised the female servants and managed the domestic operations. The cook, often French, because French cuisine was fashionable, commanded the kitchen with absolute authority. Below these senior servants were footmen, maids, laundresses, kitchen helpers, stable hands, gardeners, and various specialised workers whose jobs filled the gaps between the major categories. The logistics of moving this workforce from city to summer residence were considerable. Servants travelled separately from their employers, usually in less comfortable accommodations, arriving ahead of the family to prepare the cottage for occupancy. They opened rooms that had been closed for the winter, aired linens, prepared bedrooms, stocked kitchens, and performed the 1,000 small tasks that transformed a shuttered building into a functioning household. By the time the family arrived, everything was expected to be perfect, as though the cottage had been waiting in readiness all winter. Here is a detail that captures the scale of domestic labour required by summer society: the laundry. A single lady, dressing appropriately for a summer season at Newport, might change clothes 5 or 6 times per day: morning dress, visiting costume, afternoon dress, tea gown, dinner dress, ball gown. Each of these outfits required appropriate undergarments, stockings, gloves, and accessories. Multiply this by every member of the family, and you have a laundry operation of industrial proportions. Laundresses worked constantly, washing, starching, ironing, and pressing the mountains of fabric that summer elegance required. The relationship between servants and employers in summer settings was both closer and more distant than during the rest of the year. Closer, because the smaller staff of a summer cottage meant that servants worked more directly with family members, without the elaborate hierarchies of a fully staffed city mansion. More distant, because summer society's emphasis on leisure and display left servants even more invisible than usual. They were expected to maintain the appearance that the household operated by magic, without visible human effort. Historians still argue about the experiences of servants in summer resorts. Some evidence suggests that servants welcomed the change of scene, enjoying the fresher air and more relaxed atmosphere of coastal and mountain settings. Other evidence suggests that the summer season meant longer hours and greater demands, as employers entertained constantly and expected their households to perform flawlessly. The truth probably varied by employer, by position, and by individual temperament. You observe a day in the life of a housemaid at a Newport cottage. She rises before dawn to light fires and prepare the family rooms for waking. She serves breakfast and then spends the morning cleaning, dusting, polishing, sweeping, making beds with military precision. The afternoon brings more cleaning, plus preparation for whatever entertainment is scheduled for the evening. If there is a dinner party, she may work until midnight. If there is a ball, she may not sleep at all. Her day off, 1/2 day per week was standard, offers barely enough time to wash her own clothes and write a letter home. One quirky aspect of servant life in summer resorts: the social hierarchies among servants themselves. A lady's maid who served a prominent hostess held higher status than a kitchen maid, regardless of their individual talents or characters. Servants from the most prestigious families looked down on servants from less established households. The dining hall where servants ate their meals replicated the social gradations of the main house, with seating arranged by status and conversation, governed by the same unwritten rules that applied to their employers. The servant question, what to do about the difficulty of finding and keeping good domestic help, was a constant topic of conversation among wealthy families. Servants who proved reliable and skilled were treasured. Servants who proved unsatisfactory were dismissed without ceremony. The power imbalance was absolute. Employers could fire servants for any reason or no reason, while servants had little recourse beyond seeking new positions. Summer employment was particularly precarious, as families often engage temporary staff for the season, rather than bringing their entire permanent household. You follow a butler through his evening rounds, watching him prepare the dining room for a dinner party. He checks the silver, ensuring that each piece is perfectly polished. He inspects the glassware, looking for spots or chips that would disgrace the household. He reviews the table setting, measuring the distances between place settings with a practiced eye. He confers with the cook about the timing of each course. He briefs the footmen on their duties. By the time guests arrive, everything's in place, and the dinner unfolds with the seamless precision that makes it appear effortless. The servants who made summer escape possible rarely appear in the nostalgic accounts of the Gilded Age. The photographs show families on verandas, not the servants who swept those verandas before dawn. The memoirs describe elaborate dinners, not the cooks who prepared them or the servers who presented them. The architecture celebrates grand public rooms, not the hidden service corridors where the actual work took place. But without this army of workers, underpaid, overworked, invisible, the entire summer world would have been impossible. They were the infrastructure of leisure, the hidden cost of escape. You shift your attention now to the youngest members of summer society, the children who experienced these seasonal migrations in ways that differed profoundly from both their parents and their urban-trapped counterparts. Childhood in the summer resorts was its own distinct world, governed by its own rules and offering its own opportunities and limitations. For children of wealthy families, summer meant liberation from the confines of city life. Urban childhoods were surprisingly restricted. Children might live in spacious mansions but have little access to outdoor play spaces, their activities limited to nurseries and supervised walks in parks. Summer cottages offered something different: gardens to explore, beaches to play on, forests to ramble through. The physical freedom of summer was intoxicating, and many adults looking back on their childhoods remembered summer resorts as places of genuine happiness. The daily routine of summer childhood combined education with recreation. Mornings might include lessons with a tutor or governess. Wealthy families did not entirely abandon their children's education just because school was out. Afternoons offered more freedom: swimming lessons, riding instruction, games with other children of the summer colony. The activities were supervised but not as rigidly controlled as city life, allowing children to develop physical skills and confidence that urban settings did not encourage. Here is a detail that captures the particular pleasures of summer childhood: the sailing. Children in coastal resorts learned to sail small boats, mastering skills of seamanship that would serve them well in adult life. The sailing lessons were taken seriously. Drowning was a genuine danger, and wealthy parents wanted their children to be competent on the water. But the lessons also offered adventure and freedom, the chance to navigate beyond adult supervision for brief, thrilling intervals. The social lives of summer children mirrored, in miniature, the social lives of their parents. Children's parties were elaborate affairs, with invitations, costumes, and entertainments scaled to youthful interests. The same families gathered year after year, and children formed friendships that would shape their adult social networks. A boy who played with the Vanderbilt children at Newport might find those connections valuable in business decades later. A girl who befriended daughters of prominent families might later rely on those friendships when navigating adult society. Historians still argue whether wealthy children benefited from the summer experience or were damaged by its emphasis on status and display. On one hand, the physical freedom and outdoor activity of summer resorts provided health benefits and developmental opportunities that urban life could not match. On the other hand, the social pressures that affected parents also affected children, who learned from early ages that status mattered and that social performance was expected. Children absorbed the values of their environment, and the environment of summer resorts taught competition, display, and hierarchy. You observe a children's party at Newport Cottage, watching young guests arrive in miniature versions of adult finery. The little girls wear elaborate dresses, the little boys wear sailor suits or velvet ensembles that seem designed more for appearance than for play. The entertainment includes games, croquet, lawn tennis, races across the grass, but also performances, a puppet show, a magician, perhaps amateur theatricals in which the children themselves participate. The mothers watch from the sidelines, evaluating performances and making mental notes about which families are raising their children properly. One quirky aspect of summer childhood: the seaside collections. Children gathered shells, seaweed, interesting rocks, specimens of marine life that they preserved in jars or pressed in albums. These collections were encouraged by parents who saw them as educational. Natural history was a fashionable pursuit, and by children who found genuine pleasure in the treasure hunt of beachcombing. Some collections became quite elaborate, with specimens labelled and organised according to amateur scientific classification. The children of servants experienced summer very differently. Those who accompanied their parents to summer resorts found themselves in an unusual position, present in places of wealth and leisure but excluded from participating in them. They might glimpse the children's parties from kitchen windows, might play on the same beaches during servants' time off, but always knew that the summer world was not really theirs. Other children of the working class remained in cities, experiencing summer as we described earlier: heat, disease, danger, while their privileged counterparts enjoyed cool breezes and ocean swimming. You follow a governess and her charges on their afternoon walk, listening to her instructions about proper behaviour and deportment. Even in relaxation, wealthy children were being trained for their future roles in society. They learned how to greet adults, how to make conversation, how to behave at table, how to display the easy confidence that marked people of their class. Summer was education in a broader sense than book learning. It was training in the performance of identity that would define their adult lives. The memories of summer formed powerful attachments to particular places that lasted throughout adult lives. Families returned to the same resorts for generations, children growing into parents who brought their own children back to beaches and mountains they had known since infancy. These attachments were emotional, but also practical. The social networks formed in childhood had real value in adult life, and maintaining connections to summer communities meant maintaining connections to power and influence. By the time summer ended and families returned to cities, children had been transformed. They were tanned from outdoor play, though too much tan was considered vulgar, and children were sometimes kept out of direct sun to preserve fashionably pale complexions. They had grown physically stronger from swimming and riding and running. They had consolidated social positions and formed new alliances. They returned to school with stories to tell and status to display, prepared for another year of urban life until summer released them again. You enter the realm of romance now, because summer resorts served purposes beyond health and social display. They were markets where marriages were negotiated, alliances were formed, and the future of American dynasties was determined. The marriage market of summer society was conducted with all the strategic calculation of a business merger, disguised beneath the rhetoric of love and romance. Young women of marriageable age were brought to summer resorts specifically to be seen by potential suitors. Their mothers orchestrated introductions, planned occasions for encounter, and evaluated the prospects that summer society offered. A successful season might result in an engagement. An unsuccessful one meant another year of strategic positioning, another summer of display and hope. The stakes were enormously high. A good marriage could secure a family's position for generations, while failure to marry well could mean social decline. The young men who served as potential suitors were themselves being evaluated with cold precision. Family background was examined. Who were his people? How many generations of wealth? Any scandals in the family history? Financial situation was scrutinized. Was the fortune secure or vulnerable? Were there brothers who might divide an inheritance? Personal qualities mattered too, but less than you might expect. A wealthy, well-connected suitor with a mediocre personality was preferable to a charming man of limited means. Here is a detail that captures the calculating nature of summer romance: the chaperoning system. Unmarried young women were never ever left alone with unmarried young men. Every conversation, every dance, every carriage ride took place under the watchful eyes of mothers, aunts, or other respectable female relatives. The system existed to protect reputations. A young woman who was seen alone with a man might be considered compromised, but it also served to control the formation of attachments. Parents who disapproved of a potential match could simply refuse to allow unsupervised contact, preventing any relationship from developing. The balls and parties of summer society were explicitly understood as marketplaces. Young women displayed themselves in elaborate gowns, their jewellery indicating family wealth, their social skills demonstrating good breeding. Young men circulated, evaluating options, dancing with prospects, making the mental calculations that would eventually result in proposals. The romance novels of the era treated this process as magical. Love at first sight across a crowded ballroom, but the reality was more calculating and less spontaneous. Historians still argue whether American marriage practices in the Gilded Age should be understood as primarily economic arrangements, or as unions that also involve genuine affection. The evidence suggests that both elements were present, but that economic considerations took clear precedence. Families invested enormous resources in launching daughters into society and expected returns on that investment. Love might develop between spouses, and many couples reportedly were happy. But love was not the primary basis for marital decision-making. You observe a young woman at her first summer season, watching her navigate the complexities of the marriage market. She has been prepared for this moment since childhood, trained in conversation, dancing, music, all the accomplishments that make a young lady attractive to potential suitors. Her mother hovers nearby, steering her toward appropriate young men and away from unsuitable ones. The young woman herself is simultaneously the product being marketed and an active participant in the marketing, displaying her charms while evaluating the men who respond to them. One quirky aspect of summer romance, the language of flowers. Communication between young people who were never allowed to be alone required indirect channels, and flower arrangements served this purpose. A bouquet of red roses communicated passionate admiration. Yellow roses suggested friendship only. White roses indicated innocence and purity. Young men sent flowers to young women, and young women interpreted these floral messages with close attention. A misstep in floral vocabulary could send entirely the wrong signal, creating complications that required delicate management. The engagement, when it came, was a triumph for the young woman and her family. The announcement was made with appropriate ceremony, the engagement ring displayed, congratulations received from all quarters. The wedding would follow, usually the next year, elaborate and expensive and covered in the society pages of newspapers, and then the young woman would transition from daughter to wife, taking up residence in her husband's world and beginning the cycle again with her own children. You watch a couple walking in the moonlight. Well, walking near each other in the moonlight, with a chaperone discreetly following a few paces behind. They are newly engaged, permitted slightly more intimacy than before, but still far from the privacy that modern couples take for granted. Their conversation is stilted by the awareness of being observed, but they are navigating the transition from courtship to marriage, learning to see each other as partners rather than prospects. The marriages that emerged from summer resorts shaped American society for generations. The merging of fortunes, the alliance of families, the consolidation of social positions, these were the real products of all those balls and dinners and carefully chaperoned encounters. The summer resorts were incubators of dynasties, places where the future leadership of American business and society was determined through the selection of mates. Not everyone found success in this system. Some young women went through season after season without attracting suitable offers, their value declining with each passing year as they aged beyond the prime marriageable period. Some young men proved unable or unwilling to commit, remaining bachelors while their contemporaries married and produced heirs. The system created winners and losers, and the losers bore their disappointment in private, while society moved on to the next season's prospects. You discover now that the wealthy men who fled to summer resorts did not entirely leave their business affairs behind. A revolution in communication technology, the telegraph, had made it possible to manage empires from seaside verandas, and the tycoons who gathered at Newport and Saratoga continued to accumulate wealth even while officially on vacation. The telegraph changed everything. Before its development, information travelled at the speed of horses or ships, and anyone who wanted to manage complex business operations had to be physically present at the centre of activity. A merchant in New York who departed for a summer in Newport essentially abandoned his business for months, trusting subordinates to manage in his absence and hoping that nothing went wrong. But the telegraph compressed distance to nothing. A message sent from Newport could reach New York in minutes, and a response could return just as quickly. You observe a summer morning at one of the Newport cottages, watching the man of the house receive his daily bundle of telegrams. They arrive with the first post, transcribed from the dots and dashes of Morse code into the cryptic language of business communication. Stock prices, commodity movements, negotiations with competitors, disputes with suppliers, all of it compressed into messages that the recipient decodes with practiced speed. Here is a detail that captures the transformation the telegraph enabled: the ticker machine. By the 1880s, these devices were available for installation in private homes, printing continuous streams of stock prices on thin paper tape. Wealthy investors could follow market movements in real time, buying and selling through telegraphed instructions without ever approaching a stock exchange floor. A summer cottage with a ticker became a command centre, disguised as a leisure destination. The combination of summer leisure and continuous business activity created a particular kind of person, the workaholic who officially was not working. These men claimed to be on vacation, told their families they were relaxing dressed in the casual clothes of resort life. But their minds never left the business world. They read financial newspapers at breakfast. They conferred with business associates who happened also to be summering nearby. They sent dozens of telegrams daily, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. Historians still argue whether this continuous connection to business represented a failure of imagination or a practical necessity. Some scholars suggest that Gilded Age businessmen were simply incapable of genuine leisure, their identities so bound up with commerce that they could not exist without it. Others suggest that the competitive pressures of the era made disconnection genuinely dangerous. Step away for 3 months and competitors might seize opportunities that could not be recovered. You follow one of these business vacationers through his morning routine. Breakfast is interrupted by a telegram requiring immediate response. The morning walk along the cliffs is accompanied by a secretary who takes notes on the day's priorities. The afternoon, supposedly devoted to yachting, actually involves a meeting with fellow investors who have arranged to discuss a railroad consolidation. Dinner conversation touches on tariff policy and international trade. The vacation is entirely consumed by business, with leisure serving only as a setting and a disguise. One quirky aspect of business at the beach, the informal deals. Because so many important businessmen gathered at the same summer resorts, deals that might have taken months to negotiate in the city could be arranged over a weekend at Newport. Introductions that required elaborate protocol in office settings could happen casually on the tennis court or the yacht club terrace. The summer colonies functioned as a kind of extended boardroom, where the informal setting actually facilitated business that might have been more difficult in formal contexts. The telegraph also enabled a kind of surveillance that modern observers would recognise. Business owners could monitor the activities of their enterprises even from hundreds of miles away, receiving daily reports on operations and sending back instructions. Workers who might have hoped that the boss's summer absence meant relaxed oversight discovered that the telegraph made distance irrelevant. The boss was always watching, even from the beach. You watch a telegram being composed, the sender choosing each word carefully, because telegraph companies charged by the word. The language of business communication became compressed, stripped of pleasantries and elaboration, reduced to the essential information that justified the expense of transmission. This compression influenced how businessmen thought about communication more broadly, creating habits of brevity that persisted even in contexts where cost was not a consideration. The wives and children of these businessmen on vacation experienced summer differently. They participated in the social life of the resorts, the calls and parties and outings, while their husbands and fathers remained partially absent, physically present but mentally elsewhere. The family vacation was not really a family experience. It was a change of location that allowed the business to continue while the family pursued its own activities nearby. By the end of the summer, the businessmen would return to their city offices, tanned and supposedly rested, boasting of their leisurely months at the seashore. But the business records would show that they had never really been away at all. The telegraph had dissolved the distinction between work and vacation, creating a prototype for the always connected life that modern technology would eventually make universal. You turn your attention now to a particular subset of summer travellers, those who came to the resorts not for social display or business, but for health, hoping that a change of climate might cure what doctors could not. The sanitariums and health resorts of 19th century America formed their own distinct world, overlapping with the social resorts but serving very different purposes. The invalid culture of the Gilded Age might seem strange to modern observers accustomed to medicine that actually works, but in an era when doctors could cure almost nothing, environmental change represented one of the few interventions that seemed to produce results. Patients with respiratory conditions reported breathing more easily in mountain air. Those with nervous complaints reported feeling calmer at the seashore. Whether these improvements resulted from actual therapeutic effects or from the psychological benefits of pleasant surroundings and attentive care was impossible to determine, but the improvements were real enough that people kept coming. Tuberculosis, the great killer of the 19th century, drove more health migration than any other condition. The disease was slowly progressive, allowing patients months or years of debility before death claimed them. Medical theory held that certain climates could slow or arrest the disease's progress, and desperate patients travelled enormous distances seeking these therapeutic environments. The Adirondacks, the Rockies, the dry Southwest all became destinations for consumptives hoping that climate might save them when medicine could not. Here is a detail that captures the particular sadness of health tourism, the one-way journeys. Many patients who travelled to sanitariums and health resorts knew they would not return home. They were going to die. The only question was whether they would die in a few months or in a few years. The resorts they travelled to became, for them, final destinations. Places where they would live out whatever remained of their lives, surrounded by others in similar circumstances. You visit a sanitarium in the Adirondacks, walking through grounds that are deliberately designed to combine medical function with aesthetic pleasure. Patients sit on verandas in wheeled chairs, blankets tucked around their legs despite the summer warmth. They breathe deliberately, performing the exercises their doctors have prescribed, trying to expand lungs that tuberculosis has compromised. The atmosphere is quiet, peaceful, and profoundly sad. A community of people waiting to see whether they will recover or die. The treatments offered at these health establishments varied from the reasonable to the absurd. Rest was prescribed, and rest genuinely helped some conditions. Fresh air was considered therapeutic, and patients spent hours outdoors even in inclement weather. But other treatments had no basis in medical reality. Electrical stimulation, water cures involving elaborate sequences of hot and cold baths, dietary regimens that promoted certain foods while prohibiting others for reasons that seemed scientific but were actually arbitrary. Historians still argue whether the health resort movement did more good or harm. On one hand, the emphasis on rest, nutrition, and pleasant surroundings probably benefited many patients, even if the specific theories behind the treatments were wrong. On the other hand, the movement diverted resources from the search for actual cures and encouraged patients to pursue ineffective treatments rather than accepting the limitations of contemporary medicine. You observe a consultation between a health resort physician and a patient's family. The doctor speaks in authoritative tones about the healing properties of the local climate, citing statistics that suggest remarkable recovery rates. The family listens with desperate hope, willing to believe that this place might save their daughter when previous treatments have failed. The doctor prescribes a regimen of outdoor living, particular foods, scheduled rest, and daily exercises. The family agrees to everything, grateful for any plan that offers hope. One quirky aspect of health resort culture, the competitive measuring of symptoms. Patients compared their progress obsessively, noting who was coughing less, who had gained weight, who seemed to be improving versus who seemed to be declining. These observations were shared in the peculiar social life of the sanitarium, where guests who might have ignored each other in healthier circumstances formed intense bonds based on their shared condition. The summer months were particularly important for health resorts, as mild weather allowed maximum time outdoors, and the pleasant surroundings provided psychological uplift that might support physical healing. But many health destinations operated year-round, with patients who had come for summer staying through winter, unwilling or unable to return to environments that their doctors warned would worsen their conditions. You spend an afternoon in the common room of a sanitarium, watching patients engage in the limited social activities their conditions permit. They play cards, read aloud to each other, discuss books and current events. The conversation carefully avoids the subject that dominates everyone's thoughts: who will live, who will die, how much time remains. The social rituals are a kind of performance, an insistence on normal life in profoundly abnormal circumstances. The health resort movement would eventually be superseded by actual medical advances, the development of antibiotics, the discovery of specific causes and treatments for diseases that had previously been mysterious. The sanitariums would close or convert to other purposes, their therapeutic claims obsolete in a world where medicine could actually cure disease. But for the period we're exploring, they represented hope. The best hope available to people facing conditions that 19th century medicine could not address. You step back now to consider how European traditions influenced American summer practices, and how Americans adapted, modified, and eventually transformed those traditions into something distinctly their own. The wealthy Americans who fled to summer resorts were looking across the Atlantic for models, but what they built was not merely imitation, it was reinterpretation. European spa culture had ancient roots. The Romans had built elaborate bathing establishments at natural hot springs throughout their empire, and these facilities had been revived and refined over the centuries. By the 18th century, European spa towns like Bath in England and Baden-Baden in Germany had become centres of fashionable society, where the wealthy gathered to take the waters and to participate in social rituals that surrounded the therapeutic activities. American resort developers looked to these European models and found much to admire and much to adapt. The emphasis on mineral waters was directly imported, giving Saratoga Springs its identity and purpose. The social rituals of calling cards and elaborate dinners derived from European aristocratic practices that wealthy Americans wanted to emulate. The architectural styles of many American summer cottages, French chateaux, Italian villas, English manor houses, represented explicit attempts to transport European civilization to American shores. Here is a detail that captures the American relationship to European culture: the Grand Tour. Wealthy Americans expected their children to travel to Europe, absorbing cultural sophistication that would distinguish them from less privileged compatriots. When these travelled Americans returned home, they brought European expectations about how leisure should be conducted. Their summer experiences were measured against memories of Baden-Baden and Biarritz, and American resorts struggled to meet standards set by centuries of European refinement. But Americans also modified what they borrowed. The rigid class hierarchies of European spa society translated imperfectly to American settings, where fortunes were new and social positions were still being established. A duke at Baden-Baden knew his place in the hierarchy, and so did everyone else. A railroad baron at Saratoga Springs occupied a position that was still being negotiated, contested, and redefined. American summer society was simultaneously more fluid and more anxious than its European models, with social boundaries that shifted in ways that would have been inconceivable across the Atlantic. Historians still argue whether American summer culture should be understood as derivative of European models or as a distinctly American creation. The truth is probably that it was both, shaped by European influence but transformed by American conditions into something that Europeans themselves found curious and sometimes admirable. Visitors from Europe who experienced American summer resorts reported being impressed by the scale of the facilities and the energy of the social life, even as they noted differences from what they knew at home. You observe a conversation between an American hostess and a European visitor, watching them navigate the differences between their cultural expectations. The European finds American informality refreshing, but also slightly shocking. People who would never dream of addressing each other casually in European settings seem to do so routinely in American ones. The American finds European formality impressive, but also somewhat stifling. The elaborate protocols seem designed to prevent genuine human connection. One quirky aspect of the European-American cultural exchange: the hiring of European servants. Wealthy American families competed to employ staff trained in European aristocratic households, believing that French chefs and English butlers brought standards of service that American-trained servants could not match. These European servants commanded premium wages and enjoyed status within their profession, their national origin serving as credentials of competence. The democratizing tendency of American society also affected summer culture in ways that distinguished it from European precedents. While European spas remained genuinely exclusive, reserved for aristocracy and the very wealthy, American resorts gradually opened to broader populations. The railroad democratization we discussed earlier, bringing middle-class visitors to destinations that had previously been accessible only to the elite, had no real European equivalent in this period. American summer culture was simultaneously more ostentatious than European culture. The scale of Newport cottages exceeded most European aristocratic residences, and more democratic, middle-class families could experience modified versions of elite pleasures. You trace the circulation of ideas between continents, watching as American innovations travelled back to Europe. The grand American hotels, with their elaborate amenities and their capacity to accommodate hundreds of guests, influenced European hotel development. The American emphasis on outdoor activity, hiking, swimming, sailing, gradually appeared in European resorts that had previously focused primarily on indoor social rituals. The exchange was not one-directional. It was a conversation across the Atlantic that shaped summer culture on both shores. By the end of the century, American summer culture had achieved a distinct identity. It remained connected to European precedents, but was no longer merely derivative. The resort communities that wealthy Americans had built were American places, shaped by American conditions, expressing American values and anxieties. They were louder than European equivalents, larger, more energetic, more competitive. They celebrated wealth with less restraint and offered democracy with less sincerity. They were, in short, distinctly American, for better and for worse. You check into a grand hotel now, experiencing the institution that served as the social and physical centre of summer resort life. The hotels of the Gilded Age were not merely places to sleep, they were self-contained worlds, cities in miniature, offering everything their guests might need or want, without ever requiring them to venture beyond the property. The Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, which we mentioned briefly earlier, exemplified the genre. It could accommodate 1,800 guests, more than the population of many American towns, and featured amenities that seemed designed to anticipate every possible desire. The main corridor stretched an entire city block, lined with shops selling everything from jewellery to newspapers. The dining room could seat thousands simultaneously, serving multiple course meals that required armies of servers to present. The public rooms offered spaces for every social function: card rooms, reading rooms, music rooms, ballrooms. You arrive at the front desk and present your credentials, beginning a process of social evaluation that starts immediately and continues throughout your stay. The hotel staff are trained observers, noting the quality of your luggage, the style of your dress, the manner of your bearing. Based on these observations, they will assign you a room. The best rooms for the most prestigious guests, lesser accommodations for those whose status is uncertain. Before you have unpacked a single bag, you have been classified and ranked. Here is a detail that captures the social complexity of hotel life: the dining room seating. Like dinner party placement, but on a vastly larger scale, where you sat in the hotel dining room communicated your social standing to every other guest. The most desirable tables, near windows visible from the main entrance, were reserved for the most prominent families. Less desirable tables were assigned to guests of lesser status. Newcomers without established positions were placed in locations that communicated their probationary status, where they would either prove themselves worthy of better placement or confirm their belonging in social obscurity. The hotels functioned as social institutions in the fullest sense. They published their own newspapers, providing guests with information about daily activities and noting notable arrivals and departures. They maintained their own orchestras, providing music for meals, dances, and concerts. They offered entertainment programs, lectures, theatrical performances, musical recitals that rivaled the cultural offerings of major cities. A guest who never left the hotel grounds could experience a complete social life, interacting only with other guests and the staff who served them. Historians still argue whether the grand hotels represented hospitality or control. On one hand, they offered remarkable convenience and comfort, anticipating needs and providing services that guests might not even have known they wanted. On the other hand, they created environments of total surveillance, where every aspect of a guest's behaviour could be observed, evaluated, and reported. The hotel staff knew who visited whom, who gambled and how much they lost, who drank to excess, whose marriage was troubled. This knowledge was power, exercised discreetly but continuously. You spend an afternoon exploring the hotel, moving through spaces that transition seamlessly from public to semi-private to private. The main corridor is essentially a public street, accessible to anyone who wanders in from outside. The lounges are more selective, their atmosphere discouraging those who seem not to belong. The guest floors are restricted, with staff positioned to ensure that only registered guests access the rooms. The gradations of access mirror the gradations of society itself, with progressive exclusivity as you move deeper into the hotel's architecture. One quirky aspect of grand hotel culture: the tipping system. While tips were theoretically voluntary, an elaborate unofficial schedule governed what guests were expected to pay for various services. Failure to tip appropriately, either too little or interestingly too much, marked a guest as lacking proper understanding of social conventions. The tips accumulated to substantial sums over a season, providing significant supplemental income to staff, but also serving as yet another mechanism of social classification. The hotels competed with each other fiercely, each claiming to offer superior accommodations, superior cuisine, superior service. This competition drove innovation, as hotels invested in amenities that would distinguish them from rivals. Elevators were installed when the technology became available. Electric lighting replaced gas. Private bathrooms appeared in the most expensive suites. The standards of comfort rose continuously, creating expectations that each successive generation considered normal, but that would have seemed magical to earlier visitors. You dress for dinner in the hotel's grand dining room, preparing for a meal that will be served with military precision to hundreds of guests simultaneously. The scale is impressive. The logistics of feeding this many people, at this level of quality, with this degree of coordination, represent a genuine organisational achievement. But the scale also creates anonymity. In a room of hundreds, your individual presence matters less. You're participating in something collective rather than personal, an experience of mass luxury that would become increasingly common in the century to come. The grand hotels would eventually decline, victims of changing tastes and changing economics. The automobile would make guests mobile, reducing the appeal of staying in one place. Changing social customs would make elaborate formal dining seem old-fashioned. The labour costs of maintaining armies of servants would become prohibitive. But in their heyday, the grand hotels were temples of summer leisure, places where the wealthy could experience everything they desired within the walls of a single enormous building. You begin to sense change now, subtle shifts in the summer world that will eventually transform everything we have described. The seeds of democratization are being planted, middle-class families demanding access to pleasures that the wealthy have monopolized, new technologies making distant destinations accessible to wider populations, new values questioning the elaborate social rituals that have governed summer society. The boarding house represented one early form of democratization. Less grand than the hotels, but more affordable, boarding houses offered summer accommodations to families who could not afford the Grand Union or the Congress Hall. These establishments clustered near the fashionable resorts, providing access to the same beaches, the same mountain air, the same scenic views, without the elaborate service and without the social prestige. A middle-class family staying at a boarding house could walk the same boardwalks as their wealthier neighbours, even if they returned at night to more modest accommodations. The camping movement offered another democratising alternative. By the 1880s, families of moderate means were discovering that they could experience nature directly, without the mediation of expensive resorts. They pitched tents in scenic locations, cooked their own meals over campfires, and enjoyed the same fresh air that sanitariums charged substantial fees to provide. This outdoor movement would eventually grow into a significant cultural phenomenon, but in the era we are exploring, it remained a small-scale alternative to established summer patterns. Here is a detail that captures the beginning of change: the excursion train. Railroads discovered that they could profit by selling cheap tickets for day trips, transporting working-class families to beaches and parks that had previously been accessible only to those who could afford full vacations. These excursion trains were packed, uncomfortable, and brief, but they opened a window into summer pleasures that most Americans had never experienced. A factory worker could take his family to the seashore for a single day, tasting the salt air and feeling the cool water before returning to the city that evening. The wealthy viewed these democratizing trends with ambivalence. Some welcomed the extension of summer pleasures to broader populations, seeing it as appropriate American progress. Others worried that the influx of lower classes would ruin the exclusive character of their favorite resorts, making them crowded and vulgar. This tension between democratic access and exclusive preservation would define summer culture for generations to come. Historians still argue whether the democratization of summer leisure represented genuine social progress or merely the extension of consumer capitalism to new populations. On one hand, working-class families genuinely benefited from access to beaches and parks that had previously been reserved for the wealthy. On the other hand, the commercial interest that provided this access did so for profit, not from democratic conviction. The excursion trains and cheap boarding houses created new markets as much as they created new opportunities. You observe a beach on a Sunday afternoon, watching the mixture of classes that results from democratizing access. Wealthy families in elaborate bathing costumes share the sand with working families in simpler attire. Children of different classes play in the same waves, their social distinctions temporarily suspended by the democracy of saltwater. But the wealthy families maintain their distance, clustering together, avoiding contact with those they consider beneath them. The beach is shared but not integrated. Democracy of access does not mean democracy of association. One quirky aspect of democratization: the guidebook industry. As travel became accessible to wider populations, publishers produced guides that explained how to visit fashionable destinations on modest budgets. These books offered practical advice: which boarding houses offered the best value, which restaurants served affordable meals, which attractions were free, along with cultural instruction that helped middle-class visitors navigate social situations they had never encountered. The guidebooks were simultaneously democratic documents and instruments of aspiration, helping readers participate in summer culture while also teaching them to want things they might not otherwise have desired. The infrastructure of summer leisure was also evolving in ways that would eventually democratize access more fully. Municipal governments began establishing public parks and beaches, providing free alternatives to commercial resorts. Charitable organizations expanded their fresh air programs for urban children, transporting thousands of young people to country settings for periods that grew longer with each passing year. Labor unions negotiated for paid vacation time, creating the conditions for working-class families to participate in summer leisure on their own terms. You sense that the exclusive world we have been exploring is not permanent. The social boundaries that seem so fixed are actually shifting, eroded by economic forces and democratic values that will eventually transform American summer culture into something quite different. The cottages of Newport will become museums. The grand hotels will close or convert. The elaborate social rituals will seem quaint and outdated. But for now, in the moment we are observing, the old order persists, elegant, exclusive, and unaware of the changes that are coming. You step back now for a final time, viewing the entire panorama of what we have explored tonight, and considering how these 19th century patterns shaped the America that would follow. The summer migration of the wealthy was not merely a historical curiosity. It was a formative experience that created institutions, expectations, and inequalities that persist to this day. The most obvious legacy is physical: the resort communities themselves. Newport, Bar Harbor, Saratoga Springs, Cape May. These places still exist, still attract visitors, still carry the atmosphere of their Gilded Age origins even as they have been transformed by changing times. Walk down Bellevue Avenue today and you will see the cottages that 19th century wealth created, most of them now preserved as museums that allow visitors to glimpse how the other half once lived. The architecture endures, a monument to an era of concentrated wealth and elaborate social display. But the legacy extends far beyond the physical structures. The concept of summer vacation itself, the idea that work should stop for a period of rest and recreation, owes much to the patterns established by wealthy summer migrants. They modelled what leisure could look like, and subsequent generations demanded access to similar experiences. The paid vacation, the summer road trip, the beach house rental, all of these modern practices have roots in the 19th century traditions we've explored. The health rationale for summer escape also left lasting marks. The belief that certain places were inherently healthier than others, that environment could affect well-being, that rest and fresh air could restore depleted vitality. These ideas persisted long after the specific diseases that drove 19th century flight had been conquered. The modern wellness industry, with its emphasis on retreats and restorative environments, echoes the sanitariums and health resorts of the Gilded Age. Here is a detail that connects past to present: the continuing migration of wealth away from danger. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, wealthy Americans fled cities in patterns that eerily echoed what we have explored tonight. They retreated to second homes in less crowded areas. They sought places where disease seemed less threatening. They used their resources to purchase safety that others could not afford. The specific dangers change, but the dynamic remains remarkably consistent. The social institutions created by summer communities also persisted, though in modified forms. The networks formed at summer resorts, business connections, social alliances, marriages, continued to shape American elite culture for generations. A family that summered at the right places, knew the right people, and married into the right circles accumulated advantages that compounded over decades. The meritocratic mythology of American society has always coexisted with these inherited networks of privilege. Historians still argue about the ultimate significance of the summer migration patterns we have explored. Some see them as evidence of plutocratic excess, symptoms of an unequal society that concentrated wealth in few hands while many suffered. Others see them as engines of cultural development, institutions that patronised arts and architecture, and created communities of lasting value. Both perspectives capture something true about an era that was simultaneously creative and exploitative, innovative and unjust. You consider the tenements we visited earlier in our journey, the suffocating rooms where the poor endured summers that killed their children, while the wealthy played croquet on Newport lawns. That inequality was not incidental to the story, it was central to it. The summer escape of the wealthy was possible only because of economic systems that concentrated resources in their hands. The pleasant experiences we have explored were purchased with money extracted from the labour of those who could not escape. But you also remember the genuine dangers that drove the wealthy to flee. The cholera and yellow fever that killed without respect for character or virtue, the filth and stench that made cities genuinely dangerous, the medical ignorance that left even the privileged without effective treatments. The flight of the wealthy was not merely about comfort, it was about survival in an era when summer in the city could mean death. The light is fading now as we approach the end of our journey. The sun is setting over those 19th century beaches and mountains, casting long shadows across the verandas where the wealthy once gathered. The sounds of that era are fading too. The clatter of carriages, the whisper of silk gowns, the splash of bathers entering the surf in their elaborate bathing costumes. You feel yourself relaxing as the story winds down, the tension of our historical exploration giving way to a gentler mood. The world we have visited was complicated, beautiful and unjust, innovative and backward, creative and cruel. It produced places of genuine loveliness and traditions of genuine worth, even as it rested on foundations of inequality that we now recognise as wrong. The breeze comes off the water now, carrying the salt smell that 19th century doctors considered therapeutic. The temperature drops as evening approaches, the cool air that made these coastal and mountain destinations so attractive to summer refugees. The sounds of the resort fade into peaceful quiet, the music stops, the conversations end, the social machinery winds down for the night. You close your eyes and let the images we have conjured drift through your mind like clouds passing across a summer sky. The marble halls of Newport, the mineral springs of Saratoga, the rocky shores of Maine, the mountain vistas of the Catskills and Adirondacks, the elaborate balls and the careful social rituals, the servants who made it all possible, the children playing on beaches, the invalids seeking cures, the businessmen who never really stopped working, the young people seeking love or at least advantageous marriage. All of it fades now, receding into history like the sun sinking below the horizon. The wealthy who fled those dangerous cities are long gone, their cottages preserved as museums, their social world dissolved by the changes of a century and more. But something of what they built remains, in the places they created, in the traditions they established, in the expectations about summer that they helped to form. The stars are coming out now over the quiet resort, the same stars that shone over those 19th century verandas where the wealthy gathered to enjoy their escape. The same ocean murmurs against the shore, the same mountain breezes stir the forest pines. The physical world persists even as the human world transforms around it. Let yourself drift now as the story concludes and the night settles in. You have travelled far tonight, through time and space, through mansions and tenements, through health and danger, and the endless human effort to create safety and pleasure in an uncertain world. The journey is complete and rest is earned. The last light fades, the sounds diminish to whispers. The cool night air wraps around you like a comfortable blanket. The story is finished and sleep awaits.